Hello there. God bless the artist. The Sanchez were an atypical family brought together by circumstance and the bonds of blood. But sometimes blood is the most dangerous type of poison. Tonight's story is titled Child Safety. The Sanchez are the living embodiment of the blended family. Like many other modern families, they were not traditionally related. They came together through various circumstances. David was the father figure, even though he had no biological children of his own. Anna was the wife and mother. She and David had met online and soon went on their first date. Neither said it, but they both knew immediately that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Both had previously been married and had several relationships, but neither had experienced a bond like they had with each other before. Both had also been through some tough times in life, and were a lot tougher than they appeared. David was a grocery store meat cutter who spent the majority of his free time writing and playing music. Anna was an artist who processed insurance claims from home. Their creative sides helped their bond as they often knew how each other was thinking. Unlike David, Anna did have a child from her previous marriage, a daughter named Christina, whom they called Tina. Tina was 7 years old when Anna met David. When David started hanging around, he and Tina also formed a bond. A few months after they began dating, David and Anna moved in together. Anna's ex-husband was actually a good father, and the two shared custody of Tina. So Tina split her time between her father's house and Anna and David's house. The family filled itself out by adopting two cats they called Iris and Checkers, and a golden retriever they called Fred. Although David had no biological children, he eventually also brought children into the household. David had a sister who had died about a year after David and Anna began dating. Several years earlier, she had lost custody of her children to the Department of Child Safety. Attempts to fulfill requirements that the department asked resulted in David's sister spiraling downward financially and psychologically, and the department eventually severed her rights, and the children were placed into the foster system. David and his sister didn't see her kids for 8 years. David was reunited with the children when the eldest found their mother's obituary online. They had been adopted by an abusive family, and over the years they had been checked in and out of various behavioral institutions for running away. When they managed to contact their uncle online, they decided to run away again in an attempt to flee to David. David and Anna offered the children sanctuary, and after learning more about their adoptive family, they decided to go through the legal process of obtaining guardianship and were granted it. It took some work to rearrange rooms in the house and establish ground rules and boundaries, but eventually, the formerly estranged children adapted to living with their uncle and aunt. The eldest was Leah, and the younger was Fern. A few years would go by, and their bond would strengthen despite the ups and downs that come with life. Though they all had multiple titles in the household when it came to how they were related to one another, they were without any doubt a family. The children would grow and life lessons were learned. The parents did their best to get by and raise the kids, often feeling overwhelmed. The family would face their first trial when tragedy struck. David had another sister, the youngest of their family. Like their other sisters, she had lived through some difficult times, and her children had also been taken by the Department of Child Safety. Her children had split up and placed into different homes. Only a short time before Leah and Fern would come to live with their uncle and aunt. David's sister had been taking great strides to improve her life, when without warning, a complication to her existing health issues would result in a systemic blood infection. Just like that, David's only other sibling was gone. The Sanchez's would gather together and move on from the tragedy. But the death of David's younger sister would set a chain of events in motion that would result in the family eventually receiving a very unexpected phone call. More time would go by, and more trials and tribulations, but the Sanchez family remained strong. Tina was now 13 years old. Leah was 17, and the family had just celebrated Fern's 15th birthday. David was at work one day and kept his phone in the locker while he was working. That day, he was gathering his personal items to head home for the day when he saw they had missed a call from a number that was listed as a private number. David thought to himself that these types of calls are usually scammers or bill collectors, but he noticed that this caller had left a voicemail, so he listened to it. To his shock, the caller was his nephew, Jay, the eldest child of his youngest sister. It had been quite some time since David and Anna had seen Jay, since he and his siblings were taken by the Department of Child Safety. David hadn't any idea where Jay was up to that point. The voicemail that Jay left didn't give any clues either, as all he said on it was that he missed and wanted to see his uncle. Unfortunately, Jay also failed to leave a number where David could return his call. David went home that day, excited to tell Anna and the kids about receiving the message from Jay. Leah and Fern had not seen Jay since all of them were very young, and they were all excited about the news as well. Anna and David discussed how nice it would be to reconnect with Jay, and David's family had been separated from each other for so long. The family waited, patiently hoping that Jay would call again and be wise enough to leave a callback number. For some reason, David missed the call again. A few days would go by, but another call would come. Once again, David was at work and missed it, but this time, Jay remembered to leave the callback number in the voicemail. When David got home from work that day, he approached the front door and was irritated to see the security screen door ajar. It was a constant battle with the kids to close the screen door, let alone lock the front door. David went inside and immediately told Anna about the call, and she encouraged him to call Jay back. David dialed the number, and the phone began to ring. A voice that was most definitely not Jay's answered the phone by saying, "EV Group Home." David asked for his nephew by name, and the man who had answered told him to hold for a moment. David realized that Jay was living in a group home for teenage boys, and he wondered how he had gotten there. The last that David knew, Jay was living with his biological father, a few towns away. After a few minutes of listening to various voices in the distant background, David heard someone pick up the phone and say, "Hello?" David asked if it was Jay, and Jay confirmed that it was him. David asked how he was doing and where he was, and Jay confirmed that he was indeed living in a group home. He told his uncle that his father had essentially kicked him out of his house in favor of his new child with his new wife. Jay, with nowhere to go, had once again ended up in the custody of the Department of Child Safety. They were the ones who had placed him in the group home. David asked Jay if he had heard from his sister, as no one had since the two of them had been separated. Jay said that as far as he knew, she was living with her biological father. After that, the conversation got a little awkward, as all David could think of to ask his nephew about was schooling. David asked if there was a way he could visit his nephew, and Jay told him that he would need to speak with his caseworker. He asked David if he could give his number to the caseworker so that she could contact him, and David agreed. The two ended the conversation, and David told his nephew that he was welcome to contact him anytime he wished. David ended the call, and Anna waited excitedly to hear about what was said. David explained to her that he didn't have all the details, and then he shared the ones that he did have with her. The kids were all excited to hear about how their cousin was doing as well, and David filled Leah and Fern in on the news. Tina was at her father's house, would need to be told later. Overall, it was an exciting day, and the family were happy at the thought of being reunited with another estranged family member. The next day, David was off from work, and he received another call. His phone identified the call as coming from the Department of Child Safety. David answered, and a woman's voice asked for him by name. He confirmed that it was he, and the woman identified herself as Jay's caseworker, Suzanne. She went on to explain to David that she was surprised to hear of his existence. Neither Jay nor his father had mentioned David to her when Jay's case was opened and his father surrendered him to the Department of Child Safety. She asked David how he was related to Jay, and David explained that Jay's mother was his biological sister. Suzanne asked David to confirm that he was referring to Jay's deceased biological mother and not his stepmother, and David told her that she was correct. She then apologized to him, offering condolences, and then explained to David that she was not Jay's original caseworker. In fact, he had had several caseworkers since he and his sibling were first seized by the Department of Child Safety a few years before. She then explained to David that was probably why she hadn't been told of him. She also said that now that she was getting all the details straight, she was glad that Jay still had someone from his mother's side to turn to. Over the next few weeks, the Sanchez family would have visits with Jay. Tina was excited to hear that contact with Jay had been reestablished. Once identity was verified, the group home allowed the family to take Jay out for the day and spend time together and reconnect. They went to dinner, movies, and to the county fair. Each time, things seemed to go well aside from the normal teenage angst and competitiveness. Occasionally, David would receive a phone call from one of the group home staff members, saying that they needed him to speak with Jay. These calls were always due to the same things. Jay would get into trouble at the group home for altercations or throwing fits. He would demand to speak to his uncle before calming down. When he got to speak with David, he would explain to him that he'd either been bullied or someone had stolen from him. David would hear him out and talk to him until he calmed down, and then he would get Jay to agree to apologize to the staff and move on. About a month after reuniting, Suzanne again contacted David and explained to him that Jay was due for his monthly meeting with her and asked if it would be okay to conduct it in the Sanchez home. She said there were some things that she wanted to discuss with David and Anna. David agreed, and the time and date were set. A few days later, Jay arrived at the Sanchez home with Suzanne. David and Anna greeted them outside and invited them in. They all took a seat at the dining room table so that Suzanne could set up her laptop, and began talking. She began asking a series of questions about how Jay felt he was doing in school and at the group home. Jay only offered the standard teenage boy response and said that he was doing okay. Suzanne then began to ask about how things were going with his visits with the Sanchez family. She asked David and Anna how they felt things were going, and she asked Jay if he felt comfortable spending time with them. Everyone agreed that things were going well. Then Suzanne asked Jay a question that David and Anna were not expecting. She asked Jay how his therapy was going. Jay hadn't mentioned to his aunt and uncle that he was seeing a therapist. Jay told Suzanne that he felt he was doing well and explained that his therapist had rescheduled their last appointment and he hadn't seen him again yet. Suzanne came to the conclusion that things were indeed going well, which led her to asking David and Anna another unexpected question. She asked them how they felt about taking Jay in. David and Anna were surprised, but at the same time, they were not, given the dealing they had already had with Fern and Leah. David and Anna looked at each other and explained to Suzanne that they had spoken about the possibility and about how they could rearrange the house and schedules to make it work if it did come to that. They then told her that they had also spoken with the other children, and they all agreed that they could make it work. Suzanne then turned to Jay and asked how he felt about it. Jay was excited at the thought of living with his aunt and uncle. He said that he missed being around family and that it would be nice to live with his cousins as well. Suzanne told him that she felt it would be good for Jay to live with them as well. She said that it would be good for his emotional health as well as his overall well-being. She explained that she could take care of all the necessities like transferring his school and therapy since the family lived 2 towns away from the group home. They would only need to decide which school he would attend. She also said that she would transfer Jay's monthly financial allotment to them from the group home to help them with some of the burden of supporting another teenager. David and Anna knew that the extra money would definitely be helpful since they now had another child to feed and clothe. After sorting out a few more details, they all agreed that Jay would live with the Sanchez family. Suzanne explained that once she was finished with all the paperwork, Jay's group home would transport him and all his belongings in the next few days. David and Anna told her they would begin making the necessary changes to the bedroom setup and other such things. A few days later, the family eagerly awaited as one of the staff members from the group home called to say they were on their way to drop off Jay. He called again as they approached in the house, and everyone met outside when the van pulled up. They all assisted Jay and the staff member in getting all of Jay's bags and boxes into the house. Once they were finished, the staff member said goodbye to Jay and wished him luck. Then he approached David and Anna. In his hand, he held a canvas bag that zipped and locked like a bank deposit bag. He unlocked it and opened it and pulled a plastic bag out of it. He handed the plastic bag to David, and he and Anna could see that it contained prescription bottles. The staff member explained that they were Jay's medications, and his pharmacy information should be transferring soon. David and Anna were a bit surprised by this, as Jay hadn't mentioned to them that he was taking medication, nor had Suzanne. David took the bag, and the staff member waved goodbye and got into his van and drove off. David opened the plastic bag and took out the pill bottles. His face took on an expression of perplexion, and Anna asked him what the prescriptions were for. David held them up so she could read them, and like he had, she immediately recognized the names of them. They were commonly known as antidepressants and antipsychotics. David took the next few days off from work to help the family get adjusted to the new living situation. Anna worked part-time from home and homeschooled Fern and Leah, so she was almost always home, but she and David thought it best if they were both home for the first few days to set new ground rules and deal with any unforeseen issues that may arise between the children or Jay's schedule. It also took a few days for Jay's school transfer to go through. It turned out that the school Jay had attended while living in the group home was a small charter school. Jay said that he felt his needs were better attended to than when he was in a public school, and he liked it better. David contacted the school and was told that Suzanne had already been in touch with them, and they just needed to know the name of the new school Jay would be attending. Since Fern and Leah homeschooled and Tina attended a school near her father's home, David and Anna had little knowledge of schools in their area and had to do some research. When they had found a few schools they thought would be good, they asked Jay which one he would like to attend, thinking it was a gesture of trust. Jay acted indifferent and indecisive when it came to choosing schools. He seemed uncomfortable with the choice, and David and Anna assumed it was just him being nervous about the new surroundings and students. David had moved around a lot as a child and could empathize with Jay when it came to those feelings. When Jay finally made a decision, it seemed like he really didn't care, and it made David and Anna feel like they had done something wrong or wasted their time. They contacted the school and filled out their portion of the paperwork. The school asked which school Jay had previously attended, and David gave them the name. The school then asked if Jay had ever been suspended or expelled. David didn't know. He asked the school registrar to hold for a moment, and he'd ask. He called Jay into the room and asked him. He put his phone on speaker so the registrar could hear. Jay nervously hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Yeah." David was surprised and forwarded the answer to the registrar. Then she asked which it was, suspension or expulsion. Jay replied that he had been expelled from public middle school, and this was why he had attended the previous charter school. Again, David was shocked. Anna was listening in the next room. The registrar then asked what Jay was expelled for. Again, Jay grew uneasy, and it was obvious he didn't want to answer, but after a moment he did. He muttered out, "Harassing girls. I got in trouble for throwing rocks at girls." Anna stepped in the room and made eye contact with David. The registrar then apologized and informed them that due to the circumstances of Jay's expulsion, he would not be allowed to attend the school. She said the school accepted very few expulsions, as it were. David thanked the registrar for her trouble and her time, and then ended the call. He asked Jay to explain himself further. Jay told him that it was 2 school years prior at the public school he and his younger sister had attended. He explained that the school had expelled him because of previous suspension. David then asked about the suspension. Anna stood quietly and looked back and forth from David to Jay as she followed the conversation. Jay then explained that he had been suspended for a week for fighting. He said that he had gotten into an altercation with some bullies that had been teasing him and his sister. He said that the school didn't care about the bullies and suspended everyone involved, except his sister. David then reiterated by stating that Jay was expelled for the second incident because of the first one, and Jay confirmed. David then asked Jay to explain to him why he had thrown rocks at girls. Jay explained that he had taken a liking to a young lady at school. When she rejected him and embarrassed and angered him, he began to ridicule and tease her instead. He said that it all culminated in an incident where he and his friend were walking home and they began throwing rocks at the girl and her friends as a joke. Unfortunately, he hit one of them, injuring her. The girl's parents took her to the emergency room and reported the incident later that day. The next day, the school took action and expelled only Jay, according to him. He said he felt bad for the incident and he was still embarrassed about the whole situation. Then he apologized to his uncle for not telling him. David was upset because he felt embarrassed by the attempt to register Jay at the school that would not accept him, but he calmed down and moved on. He told Jay that he may not have a choice in what school he attended because it may be a matter of which one would take him, and Jay said that he understood and it was fine. David called another charter school, a much smaller one. Their website said they were a non-traditional school that offered various schedules and accepted students who may have had disciplinary issues at other schools. When David spoke to his school's registrar, she asked for details of the incident, as the other had. After David explained it to her, she said that since it had been 2 years and he had no reported incidents at his most recent school, that they would accept him. David and the registrar completed Jay's sign-up, and David forwarded the information for Jay's caseworker so that the school could contact her and do the rest. A few days later, Jay would begin attending school. Though the schedule was not what they had expected. At this school, Jay only attended 4 hours a day. He had additional work to complete at home online. In addition to that, he only needed to attend in person twice a week. The rest of the week, he could do his work from home. The schedule made things a little difficult for the Sanchez family, as they had to fit Jay's schooling in between Fern and Leah's homeschooling and Anna's work from home schedule. It wasn't easy, but they acquired a new tablet and made things work. The first few days of adjustment seemed to go well. The kids spent time conversing and getting acquainted with each other. David and Anna occasionally had to ask them to quiet down when they got too excited over discovering they all had the same taste in music or an anime series. It was when they disagreed about something that things started to get awkward. David and Anna took note, but attributed it to them just being teenagers. There was one incident where Jay had declared his love for a popular anime series. When Ferd told him they didn't particularly care for it, and it was too mainstream, Jay seemed to take it personally and hid away in his room for a time. After the first few days of settling in and fixing trivial disagreements, David felt that it was okay for him to return to work, as Jay would be starting school. Aside from forgetting to tell Jay about Anna's occasional asthma attacks and thus causing a freak out, everything else was going pretty smoothly. Anna agreed that she believed things would be fine and they could get started back to something of a more regular routine. The first day that David was back at work, he texted Anna on his break to check on things at the house. Anna replied that things were a little tense as Jay wasn't really working on his schoolwork. She said that she was doing her best to keep him motivated, but it was difficult. She told David that she would talk to him more about it when he got home from work. David asked her if she wanted him to come home, and she declined, stating that it wasn't necessary. David felt a little anxious about things, but he went about his workday and checked in with Anna on the rest of his breaks. That day when David arrived home from work, the security screen was ajar again. He groaned with irritation and tried the front door. It was unlocked. He shook his head with disapproval as he entered. Fred rushed to greet David at the door, and Jay was playing a first-person military shooter game in the living room. He was extremely excited to see David and share how his first day of online schooling went. He told David that his classes were easy and he was able to finish his work quickly and take the rest of the day off. He said that he spent the remainder of the day playing video games. After hearing him out, David asked Jay to give him a few minutes to change out of his work clothes and speak with Anna. He asked Jay where his aunt was, and Jay replied that he believed that she was in their bedroom. David made his way down the hallway and noticed that the rest of the children had closed their bedroom doors, which was unusual because no one ever did that. Anna had also closed the door to their bedroom, which David felt odd. It felt awkward, but he lightly knocked twice and then opened the door and entered. Anna was sitting in the recliner the couple had next to their bed, holding her laptop. She was visibly upset. David closed the door behind him and asked her what was wrong. Anna explained to David that she had heard everything that Jay had just said to him, and she wasn't happy about it. When David asked why, she explained that it was because Jay was lying. Anna went on to describe the day from her point of view. She told David that the reason she was currently working on her laptop was because it was the first opportunity she had had that day to do so. She explained that getting Jay to do his schoolwork was a very frustrating task. At first, she had attempted to work in the same room with him. He had expressed worry that he wouldn't be able to understand the online instructions without a teacher present, and asked if she were willing to assist him if the need arose. Anna agreed and allowed him to sit in a chair in the office using his new tablet, while she worked on her laptop at the desk. The arrangement did not work. Anna said that Jay spent more time trying to talk with her about mundane subjects like anime and video games than he did trying to accomplish his schoolwork. She asked him repeatedly if he needed assistance, but he just kept saying no, that he just couldn't get into the work. When she attempted to explain to him that he was distracted and that she was going to work in her bedroom, that attempt had failed as well. He began popping up in the open door every few minutes to ask questions. Some about his schoolwork, but mostly not. Anna then attempted to close her bedroom door, but Jay began knocking on the door incessantly for the same purpose. Anna went on to explain that Jay had also continuously badgered Fern and Leah all day, which is why they had also closed their bedroom doors, as they were both attempting to finish their own schoolwork following a day of answering Jay's questions about his. Finally, Anna told David that Jay did finally complete his work, or at least he had told her he did. Then, he spent the rest of the day playing video games up until just before David had walked in. She sarcastically added that at least that part of Jay's summation of the day was true. David apologized to Anna and told her that he would have a talk with Jay. He changed out of his work clothes and began to leave the room. Anna asked him to close the door behind him as she still had some work to finish for the day. David would have never thought to do that and felt bad that he had to, but as he left the room, he closed the door. He went out to the living room and asked Jay to pause his video game for a moment. Jay did so and asked David what it was. David asked Jay to give him a more detailed description of how his day went, citing that Anna had told him a few things. Jay grew visibly anxious and didn't want to speak. David stared at him as he appeared to attempt to deduce what David was referring to. David decided to ask if Jay had any trouble with his schoolwork or if he had just been distracted by the day. Jay hesitated, but answered that he guessed that he was a little distracted. He then added that some of the work was confusing. David asked if that was why he had bothered his aunt and cousins all day, and Jay replied that it was. He said that he needed help with a few things. David then asked Jay to confirm that he had the ability to contact his teachers online while he was doing his schoolwork that way, and Jay replied that yes, he could. David then asked why Jay had not emailed or direct messaged his teachers with questions instead of asking his aunt and cousin. Jay had no reply to that one. David explained to Jay that he needed to contact his teachers for assistance with his schoolwork. He told him that his cousins had schoolwork to do of their own, and reminded him that his aunt did her job from home, and that Jay had kept her from it. Jay's face looked like he was going to cry. David asked Jay to be a little more independent in doing his schoolwork, and to utilize his teachers, as that's what they were there for. Then he asked Jay if he had completed his necessary work for the day, and he replied that he had. David began to walk away when Jay returned to his video game. David knocked on each of the children's doors and made his way back down the hall to check on them. Fern and Leah both said they were okay. Jay had just been annoying all day. They had both finished their homeschooling for the day and were doing other things. As he left each of their rooms, he asked if they wanted the door closed again, and they both replied yes. He was still concerned about this as he returned to his and Anna's room to tell her that he had spoken to Jay. As he was about to open the door, he looked down the hall just in time to see Jay quickly hide around the corner. Some time passed, and although Jay often still struggled with staying focused on his schoolwork at home, his teachers claimed that he was doing fine and was up to date on things when he attended his in-person days. While frustrating, the family got through it. Other things had begun to happen at home, though. One morning, Anna woke. David had already left for work. The kids had already thwarted her plans on sleeping in, as someone had already been about in the kitchen, making noise. Anna shook off the grogginess and got up to go out and make some coffee. When she got out to the kitchen, she found Leah was the one rustling about. She seemed upset, which was honestly how she was often, personality-wise, but it was different this time. Something really seemed to be genuinely bothering her that morning. Anna asked her what was wrong, and Leah exploded into a frenzied rant about what had happened after David and Anna went to bed the night before. It took a moment, but Anna got Leah to calm down enough to repeat what she was saying in a coherent manner. Anna began the process of making coffee as Leah began her story again. Leah began by saying that after David and Anna had gone to bed, the kids all congregated in the living room to watch television together. There had been no prior discussion as to what they would watch, so Leah had decided to choose something. Apparently, Jay was not happy with her choice and initially asked to watch something else. Unfortunately, Fern liked the show that Leah was putting on too, so Fern and Leah jokingly put it up for a makeshift vote. They, of course, voted 2-1 and declared that Leah's choice was what they were going to watch. Leah went on to say that Jay's demeanor immediately changed after that. He demanded that Leah give him the remote control. Leah declined, and Jay stood and walked over to her. He stood over her, and she sat on a couch and put out his hand for her to give him the remote. At this point, Leah was beginning to become irritated at the whole scene. She aggressively declined again. Then Jay grabbed for the remote and attempted to wrestle it away from Leah. He demanded that he make the choice as he was the oldest of the children. Leah quickly reminded him that he was wrong, as she was a year older than him, and declared that by that logic, she was the one who should choose. Jay continued to attempt to wrest the remote from Leah's hands as Fern got involved. Fern attempted to get between the two and push them apart, but their attempt was in vain as Jay shoved them back down to the couch with one hand as he continued to wrestle for the remote with the other. As Leah continued the story, Fern entered the kitchen. The coffee was finished brewing, and Anna offered to serve cups to the two kids, but both declined. She asked Leah to go on. Leah explained, but she then threatened to wake up David to discuss the current disagreement. She said that Jay then leaned down and got into her face. He said to her, "Who do you think he's going to side with? I'm a boy." Anna's face turned to a look of confusion as she asked Leah if she was serious, and Leah and Fern both confirmed. Fern then reiterated by stating that Jay tried to say that no matter what, Uncle David would side with him because he was male. Fern, being non-binary, was especially offended. Leah said that Jay then grinned at her and said there was nothing she could do about it. Not wanting to lose her own temper, Leah relinquished the remote control, and she and Fern got up and went to Fern's room. As they sat to discuss what had just happened, they heard Jay turn on the video game console. Anna could hardly believe what she had heard. Other than the issues of schooling, Jay had been acting like a gentleman. To hear that he went on a sexist tirade was surprising, but Anna didn't feel that Fern and Leah would lie about something like that. Being siblings, they were known to back each other up and even conspire together at times, but never for anything as serious as this. She asked the kids to allow her to drink her first cup of coffee and process everything in her head. Jay hadn't come out of his room and was presumably still sleeping, so she couldn't talk to him about it yet anyway. Fern and Leah agreed and went to their rooms. A short time later, Anna was sitting at the dining room table and going through her emails. When she heard Jay's bedroom door open, she heard him go into the bathroom and waited, assuming that he would come to the kitchen area next. She was finishing her second cup of coffee and still wasn't sure how she was going to confront Jay about the evening before. Fern and Leah were still in their rooms with their doors closed. David walked into the break room at his store. He took his phone out of his locker, grabbed his coffee cup, and sat down to text Anna as he always did on break. When he turned on the screen, he discovered that Anna had already texted him many times. He scrolled to the beginning of the thread and began reading. Anna had texted him a summarized version of the story that Fern and Leah had told her, for which made up the first half of the text thread. The rest told what happened that morning when Anna attempted to confront Jay about the evening before. David's nostrils flared and his brow wrinkled with anger as he read Anna's description of the morning. Anna had texted him to let him know that there had been a disagreement about the TV the night before, and she told him that she had attempted to confront Jay about it, but that it didn't go well. When Jay got out of the bathroom, he came out to the kitchen area as Anna had expected. He said good morning to her, and she said it back. As Jay served himself some orange juice out, Anna asked him to come over to the table and sit so she could talk to him about something. He happily obliged, and as he sat, she told him that Fern and Leah had mentioned to her that there was a disagreement over the TV the night before. His demeanor quickly changed, and his happy face changed to anxious. Anna asked him to tell his version of what happened, and Jay hesitated for a moment. Then he told her that he was trying to suggest they pick something all three of them wanted to watch, but that Fern and Leah outvoted him to be mean. Anna mentioned that Leah had said he attempted to take the remote control by force. Jay got quiet and had no answer. Anna then mentioned that Fern and Leah said he told them that he was sure David would side with him if they woke him to settle the dispute. Jay's demeanor quickly changed again, this time to anger. He stood and shouted at Anna, "Why wouldn't he? He's my uncle." Anna quickly sat back in her chair in a defensive posture. Jay then turned and walked down the hall to his room and slammed the door. David texted Anna, "Thank you for texting him this information," and he apologized to her for Jay's outburst. He texted her that he would speak to Jay when he got home from work and asked her if she needed to leave early. Anna replied that she did not, and David went back to work. Later that day, David arrived home from work. Once again, the security screen door was ajar and the front door was unlocked. David entered the house, and as he closed the door behind him, he shouted that he hoped one day everyone would learn to close the security door and lock the front door. Fred rushed out from the hallway to greet David. The house was quiet and no one was around. David made his way down the hall, and all the bedroom doors were once again closed. He approached his and Anna's bedroom and entered. Anna was sitting in the bedside recliner, reading a book, and Fred brushed past David and jumped onto the bed and laid down. David kissed Anna and asked her how the rest of the day went. Anna stared at him in frustration at first. She looked at him like she wasn't sure where to start. First, she filled him in on the rest of the details about the initial argument between the kids. She hadn't told him about the alleged sexist ageist remarks, and that Jay had made toward Fern and Leah, and David was both confused and irritated to learn about that. Anna went on to explain that the rest of the day had been rough. Jay's behavior had been very aggressive and negative since their conversation that morning. She was irritated because he had been slamming doors all day. Fern and Leah had stayed in their rooms all day to avoid Jay. Anna further explained that she didn't think that Jay had done his schoolwork, as he had expressed frustration with it earlier, and when Anna had refused to help him, he threw a fit and said he would just email his teacher and wait. David asked Anna why she refused to help him, and she replied that it was because he didn't actually want help. He wanted her to do it for him. David took a few moments to analyze everything, and then he told Anna that he was going to speak with Jay. He exited their room and crossed the hallway to Jay's room. He knocked and entered. Jay was laying on his bed, sleeping. David walked over to him and shook him while calling out his name. Jay woke and acted groggy. He slowly sat up and asked David what he needed. David asked if he had done his schoolwork for the day, and Jay replied that he couldn't because he had a question and was waiting on his teacher to reply. David asked when the last time he attempted to contact his teacher was, and Jay replied, "This morning." David then asked Jay why he hadn't attempted to contact his teachers again, as it was now mid-afternoon, and he replied, "I don't know." David's frustration grew, and he told Jay that he had been told about the previous night's argument over the TV. Jay remained silent, and David asked him to tell him what had happened. Jay hesitantly explained that he requested they watch something that all three wanted to, but that Fern and Leah had ganged up on him and refused. David replied that it wasn't ganging up, but rather a vote, which is how things were decided in this household. David then asked Jay if he tried to take the remote control forcefully, and Jay replied that he was simply going to hold on to it while they reconsidered what to watch. At this point, David felt that Jay was lying to save himself, and he was getting angry. David then asked Jay if he had told Fern and Leah that he should make the decision because he was the oldest, and and he would take his side in the argument because they were both male. Jay stayed silent. David first reminded Jay that Leah was a year older, and Jay sighed and said that she had already reminded him of that. David further explained that it didn't matter who was older. David continued that gender also didn't matter in this house because sexism was not tolerated. Votes were how things were to be decided between the kids, and that was exactly what Fern and Leah had done. Jay looked like he was going to cry, which further irritated David. He got into Jay's face and told him, "Don't you ever let me hear that you're being a sexist ass again." As he exited the room, he told Jay to email his teacher again, and that he needed to follow through with things like that better from then on as well. As time went on, things didn't seem to change. Getting Jay to do his online schooling was a daily struggle for David and Anna, and yet Jay's teachers continued to say that he was doing fine, as they would see him at school in person. Jay also began displaying some odd behavior patterns at home. Anna was in the kitchen doing some dishes one day when the overwhelming feeling of being watched came over her. She turned around and discovered Jay standing in the doorway, just watching her. She asked him how long he'd been standing there, to which he only replied, "I don't know." Anna then asked Jay if he needed something. Jay shook his head no. Anna then asked him why he was standing there, to which, again, he simply replied, "I don't know." Anna tried to ignore him and went back to doing dishes, but even not facing him, she could tell that he was still standing there because his gaze brought an uncomfortable anxiety all about her. After a few minutes, she turned around again, and Jay was indeed still standing in the doorway, just watching. Anna couldn't take it anymore, and she asked Jay again if he needed something. Again, Jay shook his head no. Then Anna lost her composure a little and aggressively asked Jay to go find something to do other than standing there. Jay acted offended, then he turned and disappeared down the hallway. This behavior began to happen far too often after that incident. Every member of the Sanchez family, in one time or another, would be startled to find Jay standing in the doorway of whatever room they were in, just watching them. Leah, being the most hot-headed in the house, would be the first to lose her temper with Jay. One day, she was sitting in the living room watching TV and playing on her smartphone when she realized that Jay was standing in the doorway watching her. She asked him what he wanted, and he said, "Nothing." She refused to believe it, though, and asked, "If you don't want anything, then why are you just standing there?" To which Jay replied, "I don't know." Leah went back to doing what she was doing, but observed Jay out of the corner of her eye. He just kept standing there in the doorway, staring at her. She stood up and shouted, "What the fuck do you want?" Jay decided to speak up this time and asked if he could play his video game. Leah replied that he had been standing there for at least 10 minutes and thus could see that she was watching her show. Jay snarkily replied, "No, you're not. You're messing around on your phone." Leah exploded into a tirade about how she could do both at the same time, and it was none of Jay's business what she was doing. She began shouting at him for standing in the doorway and calling him a creep for doing so. She kept going on about other things, but he had recently done that upset her, but before things could escalate, Anna came down the hallway and asked what was going on. Leah continued her tirade, shouting to Anna what had just happened. Anna couldn't get Leah to calm down. Leah got into Jay's face and again started calling him a creep, a sexist, and every other name she could come up with. Jay's eyes began to swell and his breathing began to speed up, when suddenly he shouted at Leah to stop yelling at him. He began punching himself in the face while repeatedly yelling, "Stop!" Anna shouted at him to calm down and stop hitting himself, but he would not let up. Leah stood with a dumbfounded look on her face, trying to hold back laughter because she felt so uncomfortable. Jay ran to the front door, opened it, and ran out. David felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He had stopped putting it in his work locker because emergency situations at home were becoming all too common. He hated it when he felt it go off in his pocket because he knew that it was almost likely not a phone call or an email notification, but rather a text from Anna or one of the kids about something that was happening at home. He stopped cutting the chuck roll he was working on and began taking off his bloody nitrile gloves. David's coworker, Miguel, was standing on the block across from him, cutting pork chops. Miguel asked if David was okay, and he watched David check his phone as he was notably distressed. David put his phone back into his pocket and let out a groan and stared frustrated at the ceiling for a moment. Then he asked Miguel if he would mind finishing the beef cutting list for him, as he needed to leave and go home and deal with the situation they had just been texted about. Miguel assured David that everything would be fine and to go home and take care of his family. A short time later, David arrived at home and immediately noticed the security screen door was closed. He tried it, and to his surprise, it was also locked, as was the front door. David thought to himself now, that had never happened since getting all the kids in. He saw it as a bad omen. When he got inside, Fred came running to greet him. Anna, Fern, and Leah were all sitting at the dining room table talking. Jay wasn't around. David sat his lunchbox down on the countertop and took a seat at the head of the table with the others. He asked Anna where Jay was, and she told him that he was in his room, that he had been quiet since he got in there. She explained that she was afraid to check in on him. Anna texted David about everything that happened, but he asked Leah to recount her side of the story for him. Leah repeated to him what had happened, and David looked back and forth from her to Anna as she spoke. Anna seemed more shocked and confused than anything else. After Leah finished, David told the group that he was going to Jay's room to talk to him. David walked down the hallway, stopped at Jay's door, and knocked. He received no response, so he knocked again, louder. Still no response. Now he was annoyed, so David opened the bedroom door and walked in. Jay was laying on his bed on his stomach, facing the wall. David called out Jay's name sternly, but Jay didn't move. David walked up to the bed and put his hand on Jay's shoulder and shook him while saying his name again aggressively. Jay finally stirred and pushed himself up, turning his face toward his uncle. His hair was disheveled and he had drool on his face. He looked as though he'd been sleeping for several hours, but it had been less than an hour since Anna had texted David. He grunted out something nonsensical and sat up on the edge of the bed, wiping the drool off his face. David asked Jay to tell him why he thought he was home from work. Jay responded that it was probably because of what had happened. David told him that he was correct and then asked him to explain what had happened. Jay frowned as if he were going to cry and looked down toward the floor. David then asked him why he was crying, explaining that he had simply asked him to tell his side of the story. Jay quickly regained his composure and sat up again. He told David Leah was yelling at him because he asked to use the TV when he noticed she wasn't really watching it. David asked Jay what Leah was doing if she wasn't watching TV, and Jay replied that she was playing on her phone. David asked Jay if he'd considered that she could be watching the show and texting a friend at the same time. Jay argued that she wasn't texting, rather she was watching videos on social media. David asked Jay what he was doing when Leah first laid claim to the TV, and Jay replied that he was doing his schoolwork. David then told Jay that if he was still doing his schoolwork, that he shouldn't have been asking to use the TV. Jay shouted at David that he was finished with his work a few minutes after Leah turned the TV on. He claimed that she had purposely began using the TV because she knew that he was almost done. David told Jay that he hardly believed that Leah had vindictively snatched up the TV knowing that he was about to use it. Jay stared silently at him. David asked Jay to tell him what happened after his aunt had gotten involved. Jay explained that Leah didn't give anyone a chance to talk, that she had just begun yelling at him and yelling to Anna that he was a creep. David explained that he knew Leah had an explosive temper and could get loud when emotional, but that he doubted she was yelling at him right in front of Anna. Jay stood and began shouting at David that if he didn't believe him to just go ask Anna. David took a moment to compose himself, and then he told Jay that if he knew that was best for him, he would sit back down and finish telling him what happened. Jay took a step back and acted like a bear had just taken a swat at him. Then he sat back down and continued his story. He told David that he didn't really remember everything that happened after that. He said that he freaked out a little and ran outside. David asked him if he remembered punching himself in the face several times before he ran outside. Jay dipped his head again and stared at the floor. David asked why he had run outside. Jay replied, albeit reluctantly, that he was going to run away. David sarcastically asked him where exactly he was going to run to, and Jay replied, "I don't know." David told Jay that "I don't know" was his answer to far too many questions, and he told Jay that he was grounded from the TV because playing the video game had become far too important to him. Jay sniffled. David asked him when his next counseling appointment was scheduled for, and Jay began to reply, "I don't," but David stopped him and said, "Never mind, I'll call him tomorrow." David turned to leave the room, and as he reached for the doorknob, he told Jay that he had left a bruise on the right side of his jaw, and that he'd be lucky if he was able to chew anything in the morning. As he closed the bedroom door, he told Jay that he knew this from personal experience. He'd had other people do that to his jaw, but he'd never done it to himself. As time passed, the incident was spoken about less and less. Jay's odd behavior would continue, though. He would frequently be found standing in doorways just staring at people. Oftentimes, the other kids would lash out at him and make fun of him for doing it. Anna and David would just tell him to go away. No one felt comfortable in the house because you never knew when you'd turn around and find Jay just standing there, staring. Leah's 18th birthday was approaching, and she was extremely excited. The Sanchez family were planning to give her a big party to celebrate. David had requested the day off from work so he could cook up a crab boil for the event, which was Leah's favorite meal. On the morning of Leah's birthday, David woke up before everyone else, as always. He waited until the time everyone else usually started getting up, and when he heard Leah up and about, he told the household smart speaker to play Las Mañanitas by Vicente Fernandez. As the song played, the rest of the family came out to the kitchen, all but Jay. The family gathered around the breakfast bar in the kitchen, and David poured himself and Anna some coffee. Leah, Fern, and Tina made jokes about the song that was playing and how David was keeping a silly old tradition alive. As the song finished, David told Leah happy birthday. As they began to talk about the plans for the day, David asked everyone where Jay was. Everyone stated that they hadn't seen him yet that morning, and the group assumed that he was still sleeping. David made breakfast for the family, and they all went about the day as normal. David and Anna went to the grocery store he worked at to purchase the supplies they needed for the birthday party. As they were headed for the checkout line, they stopped to chat with one of David's coworkers. While they were talking, Anna received a text message from Fern. Anna apologized and interrupted the conversation to tell David that they had to go right away. They said goodbye to his coworker and hurried through the self-checkout line. As they loaded the groceries into the car, David asked Anna exactly what she had been texted. Anna explained that Fern had texted and said that Leah and Jay were yelling at each other again, and they were afraid things were going to get physical at this time. David and Anna rushed home, and when they arrived, they both noticed that the security gate was ajar again. Anna worried that Jay may have run out the front door again, and feared that Leah and Fern may not have tried to stop him. David told Anna to go inside and check on things, as they couldn't hear any noise coming from the house. While she waited inside, he gathered the groceries and carried them all in himself. He went in and set them on the kitchen counter and headed down the hallway. Jay's door was closed and his room was quiet. Anna was in Leah's room with her and Fern. They were explaining what happened while David and Anna were gone. David interrupted and asked them to start at the beginning, as he needed to hear too. Fern told David that Leah and Jay had been arguing over the TV again. Jay had stayed in his room the entire morning and skipped breakfast with the family. Fern went on to say that as soon as David and Anna left the grocery store, Jay came out of his room, went to the bathroom, and then headed straight to the living room. He immediately turned on the TV and his video game. What he didn't realize is that Leah was in the kitchen making herself an iced coffee and had planned on watching one of her shows when she was finished. Leah then spoke and said that when she heard the TV and game turn on, she told Jay that she was about to use it. He ignored her. She tried to get his attention, but he continued to ignore her. She said she just stood there for a moment, dumbfounded at his rudeness. That's when things took a bad turn. According to Leah, Jay then asked her why she was standing in the doorway, just staring at him like a creep. Fern said that they were on their way to the kitchen at that moment and happened to walk in just as he said that. Leah then exploded with anger. She walked over and turned the TV off. Jay yelled at her for doing so. She then began to yell back at him that he was being a dick, and it was her birthday, and he was just being plain rude. Fern said that Jay then stood up, and that the yelling escalated to the point that you could no longer tell what either of them were saying. Leah said that Jay tried walking past her, but she did not move. He put his hand on her shoulder and pushed her out of his way. That set her off more, and she shoved him back, knocking him over and back onto the couch. Fern said he then stood up and got into Leah's face. Fern stepped up next to Leah and yelled that Jay stop and go away. Jay stood glaring at Leah for a moment. Fern said they didn't want to show it at the time, but now admitted the look he had in his eye scared them a little. Then he turned and walked through the dining room and kitchen to get around them and go down the hall to his room, where he slammed the door shut. David was an old school kind of guy, and although he did his best to keep his mind open and up to date with modern kids and their pronouns and binary versus non-binary belief systems, he did not like that Jay had actually gotten physical with Leah. Even if it was just a slight push to get by her, he told the group that he would go talk to Jay, and he headed for Jay's room. He knocked on the door hard and got no response. He opened the door and looked in. Jay was laying on his bed, on his stomach, asleep. David called out his name loudly, and Jay shot up, confused. His uncle told him to sit up and wake his ass up because he needed to speak with him. Jay sat on the edge of the bed and gathered himself. David told Jay to explain to him what had happened while he and Anna were out. Jay slowly told his own version by saying that he was still half asleep when he got to the living room and that he hadn't ignored Leah. She didn't give him a chance to say anything. He said that she just walked in and turned off the TV and began yelling at him about how it was her birthday, so she could get whatever she wanted that day. He said that he had argued with her, but got tired of the yelling and went back to bed. David stared at Jay with a fire in his eyes, and Jay could see it. He asked David why he looked so angry. David asked him if he had left anything out. Jay replied that he did not. David gave him one more chance to say if there was anything else, and he remained silent. David then asked him why he tried to push Leah out of his way. Jay said that he didn't. David's nostrils flared. David said he was told that Jay tried to push Leah out of the way so that he could get by her. Jay's eyes started to well up and his breathing quickened. David asked him if he had put his hands on Leah. Jay looked down at the floor and muttered, "Yes." David told Jay that if he ever found out that he put his hands on any of the others, that he would have to spar with his uncle. Jay began to cry and yelled at David that she had shoved him and that he fell. David admitted that he knew about that too, but said he didn't care because Jay had acted first. He reiterated that he had warned Jay never to put his hands on anyone again. Jay then shouted, "What about what she did to me after that?" David was confused and asked Jay what he was talking about. Jay pulled up the sleeve of his hoodie and showed David the inside of his forearm. There were deep scratches running down the arm, like he had been clawed. David asked what he was looking at, and Jay said that after Leah shoved him down, he got up and tried to go through the kitchen to get around her. He said that when he did, she grabbed his arm. He claimed that he told her to let go and she wouldn't. She just kept yelling and calling him names. He said that he tried to pull his arm away, but she would not release her grip. He said that instead, she dug her nails into his arm and scratched him. He said he was then able to get away and ran to his room. He then told David that he had put his hoodie on so that Anna would not see it because he wasn't going to say anything. David was baffled. He didn't want to believe Jay, but Leah did have a temper and had a history of physical altercations at school prior to coming to live with him and Anna. Surprisingly, David found himself torn between what to believe. After a moment of confusing deliberation, David told Jay that he would talk to Leah about the scratches. He also told him that he was still upset that Jay got physical first, and that his earlier warning stood. He turned around and left Jay's room, closing the door behind him. David could hear the others still in Leah's room, so he rejoined them. He told them what Jay had said as his version of the story. When he got to the part about the scratches, Leah again lost her temper. She began yelling that he was lying and that it would never happened. She showed her fingernails to her aunt and uncle to prove they weren't even long enough to do that. David asked Leah if things had gotten physical between her and Jay again, and she denied it.
She said that they didn't even push or get close to each other during the argument, other than the initial push where he fell back onto the couch. She reiterated that there was no way she could have scratched him. David accepted Leah's explanation and told her that he wasn't going to put much stock into what Jay was saying about the scratches, though he did wonder how he'd gotten them. Leah was still not happy with the outcome of things, though. She kept shouting about how Jay had been doing things that he wasn't getting in trouble for, and that she was tired of him being disrespectful to her when David wasn't around. Leah had a few friends that were coming over for her birthday crab boil and cake, and she declared that she didn't want Jay to be around while her friends were there. David and Anna were a little reluctant as they both felt this could cause more problems, but Leah was so upset they knew that she wouldn't calm down unless they agreed to her wishes. David went back to Jay's room and knocked on the door and opened it. He told Jay that he was grounded for the evening for the incident and that he could eat dinner in his room during the birthday dinner. Jay exclaimed that it wasn't fair, but David told him that punishments weren't supposed to be fair. Jay began crying and shouting that it was the only one who ever got in trouble and punished for things, but David just stood and allowed him to rant, not really acknowledging anything that Jay was saying. When he finished, Jay laid down on his bed on his stomach and began to cry into his pillow. David asked Jay if he was finished, and then he told him that his reaction to his punishment had been a little extreme. He told Jay that all he had to do was eat in his room, and he was not that big of a deal. David restated to Jay that he was lucky that things didn't get more physical because he would be in more trouble. Jay pushed himself up and shouted that things did get physical, and David didn't care. David ignored the last statement and exited the room, closing the door behind him. Later that evening, the family was finishing up the crab boil dinner. Tina had come from her father's house to join in the festivities, and two of Leah's friends had come over. Leah was sitting at the table with her friends, Fern and Tina, while David and Anna cleaned up the kitchen. The group were busy gossiping about mutual friends and talking about their favorite musicians' new releases. David and Anna were chatting about various topics and paying no mind as they cleaned up when suddenly the evening's festivities took a bad turn. Out of nowhere, Leah shouted, "What the fuck are you doing?" The room got quiet, and the group at the table were all looking toward the hallway. David and Anna were surprised by Leah's outburst. David took a step back to look around the wall that separated the kitchen from the hallway. When he did this, he saw Jay standing there, just leaning up against the wall, staring at the group at the table. Leah began shouting at Jay to go away as her friends sat uncomfortably watching the scene unfold. Leah got up from her chair and began walking toward Jay, still shouting all manner of insults and profanities at him. Anna stepped over and blocked Leah's path as David approached Jay and asked him what he was doing. Jay replied, "Nothing." David asked him why he was standing there where he had told him to stay in his room tonight. Jay sarcastically replied that David had only stated that he had to eat in his room. David began to get angry now. He got into Jay's face and reminded him that he had also said that he was grounded for the evening, and that he meant to stay in his room. Leah continued to shout insults at Jay, using the term creep most frequently. David shouted at Leah to be quiet, stating that he didn't need her assistance. Then he turned to Jay and told him to go back to his room. Jay looked angrily at Leah, and then went back to his room. After Jay closed his bedroom door, Leah would still not calm down. She started going on about how she was tired of Jay being a creep and always standing around staring at everyone. She talked about the various incidents between the two of them and how she was done with trying to get along with him. She then turned to her friends and told them about Jay accusing her of scratching his arm. David and Anna were doing their best to try to calm her down, but Leah would not let up. Then, out of the blue, she told them that she was moving out. David and Anna were both shocked and asked her if she was serious. Leah replied that she was, saying that she had begun speaking with one of her friends about it. She stated that she was finished with Jay and that she couldn't take it anymore. David reminded Leah that she didn't have a job. Leah responded that she was going to live with a friend and her mom until they could both save enough money to get their own apartment. She also said that her friend's mother was helping her get a job at the place where she worked. Then Leah hit the family with a real shocker. She was leaving after dinner was over. David told her that she was 18 now and that it was her decision. A short time later, the cake and ice cream were finished and everything was cleaned up. Leah had a few bags and boxes together, and the friends who came helped her load them into the car of one she was moving in with. Everyone but Jay gathered outside as Leah and her friends were about to leave. Leah hugged Fern, Tina, and Anna and got into her car, and everyone drove off. As the family watched the cars drive off, David turned to see Jay standing in his window watching as well. He had a sinister smile on his face. Some time passed and the Sanchez family began to adjust to Leah's absence. Fern and Tina had been sharing a room when Tina wasn't at her father's, so Leah moving out was bittersweet for the two of them, as now they could have their own rooms. To avoid any further issues, David and Anna had given in and purchased TVs for all of the kids' rooms. The game system actually belonged to David though, so it remained in the living room. All the kids now needed to ask David for his permission to use it. Instead, most of the time, Jay would now spend his time in his room playing games on his tablet. Too much time sometimes. Jay's problems with his schooling continued. David and Anna would often catch him using the tablet for games or chatting with people on social media. Jay had gone through social media and connected some friends at the group home that he had lived in. He also reconnected with a friend from his life prior to the group home when he was living with his biological father. David told Jay that it probably wasn't a good idea to maintain contact with some of the people from his past. Not all the other boys in the group home were there for reasons like his, and David tried to tell him that some of those boys were not good to be around. Jay had even shown David an article on a website of a local news station that was about a young man going missing from a group home. His body had been recovered from the side of a highway a few counties away. Jay told David that the young man was a staff member at the group home he had lived at. These things left David and Anna with a conundrum, as they couldn't punish Jay by taking the tablet away because he wouldn't be able to do his schoolwork. They also found it strange that he got into so much trouble at home for not doing his schoolwork, but his teachers at the school continued to say he was doing just fine on the days that they saw him in person. Jay would struggle so much, stating confusion, and then his teachers said all was well. It was frustrating for David and Anna. Jay's caseworker had met Jay and the family several times on her regular visits. She began to push the idea of David and Anna taking the next step beyond legal guardianship for Jay. She wanted the family to officially adopt him. This was a thought that David and Anna were comfortable with at first, but not so much anymore. On one of her visits, Suzanne was discussing matters with Jay, David, and Anna. She was making an idle conversation with Jay to make him feel at ease when she mentioned something that had not come up before. Jay had mentioned an event that happened before he went to the group home. Suzanne asked him if it had taken place during the time period that he lived with his cousin, and Jay confirmed. David and Anna had no knowledge of Jay living with a cousin, and upon hearing this, they looked at each other, confused. After the visit was over and Suzanne had left, David asked Jay when he had lived with a cousin. Jay told David that he had lived with his cousin JD for a few months. This came as an even bigger shock to David because JD was also his cousin, the son of his stepfather's sister. David asked why he had lived there, and Jay replied that his father and JD thought that it might help Jay with the issues he was having getting along with his father. David then asked why he had left after a few months. Jay replied that some stuff had happened, and JD kicked him out. David could tell that talking about this made Jay ill at ease, so he left it at that. Instead, he decided to have a talk with Anna about it. David was not particularly close with his stepfather's family. He never felt that they accepted him, and following the deaths of his mother and both his sisters, they had all but abandoned him and not contacted him in quite some time. The only time Anna had ever had contact with them was at funerals. During the visit earlier, Anna heard Suzanne mention Jay living with a cousin, but she hadn't paid mind to it. When David told her that he learned the cousin she was referring to as JD, it all changed. She asked David why JD hadn't contacted him, and David said that he had no answer for that. After a lengthy conversation, Anna finally convinced David to call JD to gain further insight to things. The family had not spoken to Leah since she had moved out. It was almost as though she was avoiding them. She did contact Fern once and said that she just didn't feel comfortable in the family home anymore, and she was tired of Jay acting differently when David and Anna were around than he did when they weren't. Tina had begun avoiding Jay as well. When he first arrived, the two often spent time together. They played video games and made videos for social media or watched TV shows together. But Tina had begun to spend less and less time with him. Anna had noticed and mentioned it to her. Tina denied, stating that everything was fine at first, but things had changed. She told Anna that hanging out with Jay felt awkward now. She said that she was uncomfortable with things he wanted to do and the way he looked at her. Anna spoke to David about her conversation with Tina, and David decided to once again confront Jay about it. When he did, Jay surprisingly admitted to having a slight crush on Tina. He said that he knew it was wrong, her being his cousin, and he told David that he did feel ashamed of it. David tried to console him, saying that he understood that Tina being his cousin by marriage and not blood could be confusing in this situation. He assured him that he was doing right by acknowledging that his feelings were misleading, and told Jay that he was proud of him for admitting to it. He suggested that Jay talk about it with his therapist the next time they meet, and Jay agreed. Jay continued to creep out the family by standing in doorways, and despite the new TV and his rules for the use of the video game system, disputes still broke out. There were a few people that Jay had contacted on social media that David had told him not to talk to for various reasons. David had caught Jay talking to all of them at some point. Jay also began demanding. He wanted clothing, shoes, and all matters of personal things that he had plenty of, but he demanded more. Over time, his behavior grew more defiant and his habits more irritating. David and Anna were out of answers. They realized that Leah was right. Jay acted different around certain people. He seemed to adapt to tell people what they wanted to hear. They decided that it was time to make the phone call to JD they'd been putting off. David and Anna received a rare occasion when all the kids were out of the house at once. Tina was at her father's for the week and Fern was out with some friends. It was Jay's in-person attendance day at school. David used the opportunity to call JD. Surprisingly, JD answered right away. He excitedly proclaimed hello to David and began to drone on about how it had been a long time and he was missed. David interjected and asked JD to dispense with the pleasantries as he had something to ask him. JD's tone sombered and he told David to go ahead. David did not tell him that Jay was living with him, but he asked JD if Jay had lived with him recently. JD paused for an uncomfortable long time before he answered. Then he told David that he had indeed lived with him for about 2 months. It was a little over a year prior. David then asked JD if he had kicked Jay out. JD denied this, stating that he had not. He said that he had actually contacted Jay's uncle, his father's brother, to ask him to take Jay in. JD explained that he didn't technically kick Jay out. Rather, he found him another place to stay. David felt as though JD was holding something back and called him out on it. He asked JD why he had found Jay a new place to live. There was another awkward silence. JD then, with a tremble in his speech, told David that he had caught Jay doing something to his dog. David's thoughts immediately went to Fred, and he asked JD to elaborate on what he meant. JD again hesitated and then went on to explain that his son had told him that he saw Jay doing some things to the family dog. He said that he couldn't even bring himself to talk in detail as to what his son said, as it made him sick to his stomach. JD then said he began watching Jay around the dog. Then one day, to his horror, he received confirmation of what his son had been reporting. He told David that he had come home from work one day and Jay was in the backyard with the dog. Jay had gotten home from school and no one else was home yet, and when JD arrived home, Jay thought he was still alone. JD said that he walked up to the kitchen window and noticed Jay out back. He said that he had the dog cornered in the back patio and looked as though he was trying to give it something. JD paused again. He told David that he then took out his phone and began filming Jay with the dog. Again, JD paused. With a shaky voice, he went on to say that what he caught Jay do on camera was too hard to think about, much less to describe. He said that he couldn't believe he witnessed it, and it took a moment to realize it was really happening. He said he stopped taking the video and ran outside to stop Jay. After another silence, JD further explained that immediately following the incident, he called Jay's father and told him that he needed to take him back. His father refused and instead told JD to contact his brother, Jay's uncle, and he was going to give it a try with Jay. He said that Jay was picked up that day and he hadn't seen or heard from him since. David again asked JD to elaborate on what exactly Jay was doing to the dog, but JD wouldn't say. He told David that if he had taken Jay in and was making progress with him, that he didn't want to change anything about the way David thought of Jay. He was afraid if he gave details, David might give up on Jay. JD insisted that he tried to tell Jay's father that David was the one that Jay needed to be with if anyone was going to straighten him out, especially after his mother's death. He encouraged David not to give up on Jay, and then told him that he had to go, and ended the call abruptly. David stared at his phone for a moment. He couldn't understand why JD wouldn't tell him more details about what had happened. The cryptic nature of the conversation made him feel uneasy. Fred walked into the room and walked up to David, who was sitting in the chair. Fred put his paw on David's knee and grinned. David reached down and began to scratch Fred's head. Jay called out for David, and when Fred heard his voice, he whimpered and turned around, backing up to David as if to ask for his protection. David called to Jay that he was in his bedroom, and when Jay appeared in the doorway, Fred slinked behind the chair that David was sitting in and hid. A sad day for the Sanchez's would come when the older of their two cats, Iris, came down ill and passed away. The family pets were all emotionally supportive to the entire family, and thus the Sanchez's treated their pets like family. So when Iris's time to move on came, they were all struck with grief. All except for Jay, seemingly. Since the conversation that he had had with his cousin JD, David had paid close attention to Jay around the family pets. Anna had as well, and each had noted some unsettling discoveries. Jay would often play fetch and tug-of-war with Fred, and he would pet the cats when they came near him, but he didn't really appear to display any fondness or compassion for the pets. He never volunteered to feed them or refill their water dishes. On the other side of the coin, he didn't seem to display any disdain for the pets either. It was more like their existence meant absolutely nothing to him, like they were just part of the environment. When Iris got sick, a mobile veterinarian was called to euthanize her at the family home. David, who was particularly fond of Iris, held her in his arms while the vet worked. But when she needed further assistance, the only family member that was willing to volunteer for that was Jay. In fact, he almost seemed eager to help. David took note. Some time went by, and Leah eventually began speaking to the family again, though she kept her distance and rarely visited. One day, Leah contacted Fern and told them that she had a friend whose cat had a litter of kittens and one still needed a home. After some persuasion, Fern talked David and Anna into letting them have the kitten, and so Puck became a member of the family. Puck was tiny when he first arrived, but he quickly grew into an adventurous little cat. One evening, David was teaching Fern and Tina how to prepare dinner, as he often did. Anna was sitting at the dining room table working on a drawing. The family had music playing on their smart speaker. Jay came out of his room, and without saying anything, he went off into the living room and turned on the TV and began playing the video games. The volume was so loud that it drowned out the music the family was listening to. They all looked at each other in disbelief that Jay had just done that. David became annoyed and walked into the living room to say something to Jay. David entered the room and asked Jay what he was doing. At first, Jay didn't respond. He was too enthralled with his game. David asked again and again. Jay seemed not to hear him. David became angry and walked over, reaching behind the TV and turned it off. Jay shouted out, asking his uncle what he was doing. David shouted back that he just tried to ask Jay the same thing, and since he ignored him, he turned the TV off. Jay apologized and said that he was just trying to play his game. David reminded him of the rule to ask prior to using the video game console. Jay rolled his eyes, which irritated David. David then pointed out that the family had been listening to music in the next room, and that the video game was so loud that they couldn't hear it anymore. He told Jay that he was being rude, and Jay replied that he didn't think it was a big deal. Jay had a way of acting when he was being taught a lesson that enraged David. Most teenagers don't pay attention when being told something, but Jay was different. He would pay attention to every word. He just didn't seem to care what you had to say, and he always had a counter-argument. When he knew he was wrong, he would create a hypothetical situation to continue the argument. He would argue just to argue, and David hated that. This time he decided to argue that the video game system should be moved to his bedroom, stating that he was the only one who played it. David pointed out that he liked to play on his days off, but with a house full of teenagers, he rarely got that opportunity anymore. He also pointed out that the video game console was used for all of their video streaming services in the living room, and if they moved it to Jay's room, the living room TV would be useless. Jay attempted to argue more, but David cut him off and told him enough. He told Jay to leave the TV and video game off until after dinner, then he could use it. Jay whined out a stereotypical teenage "fine" and agreed. Puck walked into the room and jumped onto the couch next to Jay. Jay put his hand out and the kitten sniffed it. David turned and went back into the kitchen to continue preparing dinner. A little while later, David was showing Tina and Fern how to pan-sear steak before putting it into the oven. The pair were sitting on a bench they had moved over from the dining room table while they watched. Checkers jumped up onto the bench and sat between them. This reminded Fern that they hadn't seen Puck in a while, and they asked if anyone else had. David told them that he had seen Puck in the living room a short time before, when he was in there. Fern got up from the bench and walked over to peek around the corner into the living room. Their timing was impeccable, and got there just in time to witness Jay fling Puck across the room. The kitten landed on the coffee table, and although he was able to adjust his body to land somewhat on his feet, the force of the toss caused him to tumble when he hit the table. Fern's eyes grew wide, and they shouted, "What the fuck?" Jay jumped at the exclamation, obviously showing that he was not aware someone had seen him. Fern charged by him, shoving him to the side to retrieve Puck, who tried to run as Fern reached for him. David and Anna had both entered the room simultaneously from different doorways, and both saw Fern push Jay out of their way. Jay very dramatically stumbled back and fell onto the couch. The look on his face was ridiculously over-exaggerated. David asked what was going on as Tina took a stance next to Anna in the other doorway. Fern was beside themselves with anger and exploded that Jay had just thrown Puck across the room as they quickly snatched the kitten up into their arms. Fern ran to their bedroom and Tina followed. David asked Jay to confirm Fern's accusation, but he just sat on the couch with a blank look on his face. David stepped closer to him, and Jay cowered back onto the couch until he was nearly lying down. David asked him again sternly, "Did you throw the kitten?" Jay denied it, saying that he had only set the kitten down. David disagreed, stating that he heard a thud right before Fern cried out. He stepped closer to Jay and was now standing over him as he laid back on the couch, his eyes welling up with tears. David told him he was giving him one last chance to own up to it. Jay started crying and whimpered that Puck had scratched him, and that he didn't mean what had happened. He said that he only meant to set the kitten down on the coffee table. David told Jay to show him the scratch. Jay stopped crying and hesitated. He asked David, "What?" David repeated that he wanted to see the scratch. Reluctantly, Jay held out his hand. David looked at Jay's hand. There was a tiny puncture mark that led to a half-inch long scratch on the outside of Jay's thumb. David leered at Jay with disgust. He asked Jay if that tiny little scratch he had just shown him was really justification for what he had done to Puck. Jay shot to his feet and got right in front of David and yelled, "Yeah, because it hurt." David felt his blood begin to boil at the fact that Jay had summoned enough gall to get directly into his face. Anna knew David well enough that she stepped up and grabbed David by the arm. The quick gesture was enough to remind David that it was his nephew standing in front of him, and he began to clearly see through the red again. David looked at Anna, who had a concern in her eyes that he had never seen before. They stared at each other for a moment, and then David refocused on Jay. David told Jay to go to his room, and then he was grounded from the video game console. Jay cried out that it wasn't fair, and David shouted that he didn't care. Jay began to whimper about how he had apologized and shouldn't be punished. David retorted that he didn't get to decide, and he was and wasn't punished. As Jay began shouting something indecipherable, David yelled at him to go to his room, stating that if he didn't, he would be forbidden from using the video game console permanently. Jay began to openly bawl as he ran into his room and slammed the door closed. David saw red again and rushed down the hallway to Jay's room and flung the door open. He yelled at Jay to never slam doors, but Jay didn't even seem to realize that his uncle has entered the room. He was lying on his back on his bed, flailing his arms and legs about violently. He screamed and cried in an endless stream of babble that could barely be understood. He began to hammer fist punch the wall as he shouted about how he hated where he was and how it was all his dead mother's fault. David charged at the bed and grabbed Jay by his shirt collar. Jay seemed shocked, as though he still hadn't realized that David was in the room until he grabbed him. He looked up at his uncle in fear. David told Jay that his mother had nothing to do with him hating the world. He let go of Jay's shirt, and Jay fell back down onto the bed. As David left the room, he stopped in the doorway. With his back turned to Jay, he told him that if he ever slammed his bedroom door again, he would take the door off the hinges and put it in the garage. Then he exited and closed the door behind him. As the door closed, Jay began to scream and cry again. He shouted various curses at everyone in the house and other people in his life, some of whom David didn't even know. The screaming and crying went on for about an hour. Fern and Tina sat in Fern's room listening while Fern held puck and checkers, hid behind Tina. David and Anna sat in the living room. Fred's ears perked up every time Jay got loud. David and Anna could hear Jay pounding on the wall, but David insisted they ignore him. All the while, David waited and listened for Jay to be stupid enough to bring up his mother again. Tensions in the Sanchez household continued to rise every day. Jay continued to stand in doorways despite how many times he'd been yelled at by every member of the house, including David and Anna, for doing it. Leah still wasn't contacting the family very often, and Tina was beginning to spend more and more time at her father's house. Constant bickering between the children about anything and everything began. Fern harbored animosity toward Jay for the incident with Puck, and they had also withdrawn from him. Video game system was no longer an issue, as Tina and Fern never played games anymore, and David utilized it on days off while Jay did his schoolwork or was at school. However, arguments over other items in the house began. Jay had become notorious for his food consumption. He often not only ate or drank the last of something, but most of it in one sitting. Fern had begun writing their name on soda cans and juice boxes in the refrigerator while stashing snack food items in their bedroom. Even though David and Anna had previously not allowed food in the kids' rooms, they now overlooked it because it was just easier. They felt like they were losing control of their household. Fern had once displayed an affinity for basketball and played in city leagues while homeschooling. As with many teenagers, though, it turned out to be a phase despite their talent for it. The basketball hoop on the garage went unused for quite some time. One day, David arrived home from work and Jay was out front playing basketball alone. David parked on the street in front of the house so that Jay could continue what he was doing. He got out of the car and Jay shouted hello to him. David approached him and commented on how no one had used the hoop in a while. Jay told him that he had spoken to a friend of his from the group home who was also attending a charter school. He said that his friend had joined a city basketball league since the school did not have a team and he was having a lot of fun. Jay then explained that he once greatly enjoyed playing basketball and bragged that he had been pretty good at it. He asked David about the possibility of joining a city league himself. He said that he wanted to practice and hone his skills so that he could try out for the university when he finished high school. He said that he had dreams of one day playing in the NBA. David was surprised that this was the first thing other than video games that Jay had shown any passion for. David was never good at pep talks, but he attempted one anyway. He told Jay that he admired his newfound drive. He warned Jay that his new dream would not be easy to fulfill, but that he understood reaching for the stars, as he had once had dreams of WWE superstardom and UFC gold himself when he was young. He told Jay that he would do his best to encourage and support him as long as he continued to show desire and to make it happen. Jay thanked his uncle excitedly and took a random shot from where he stood. He missed. David shook his head and turned around to go inside the house. Later that evening, David and Anna were in the living room watching TV when Fern walked through the room and out through the front door. David and Anna noticed they seemed to be irritated. A moment later, shouting could be heard from outside. It wasn't long before the front door flung open and Jay walked in, followed by Fern. The two were arguing about the basketball that Jay was using. David intervened and asked what was going on, as the two argued in the hallway doorway. Jay said that Fern was trying to take the basketball away from him, and Fern fired back that it was their ball. Tensions between the two had not let up since the incident with Puck. Jay argued that he had been using the ball all day, finding it in the garage, and Fern stated that they did not care. David told the two to calm down, and he asked Jay if he had gotten Fern's permission to use the ball. He shouted that he did not, because he wasn't aware the ball belonged to Fern. David then asked Fern if it were okay for Jay to use the ball. Fern defiantly shouted, "No!" Fern explained that they did not want Jay using any of their things and demanded that he give them back the basketball. David pointed out to Fern that they themselves had not used the ball in a long time. Fern stated that they did not care and once again demanded that Jay give them the ball. David let out a disgusted sigh and told Jay to give Fern their ball. Jay questioned why. David told Jay to just give the ball to Fern. Fern walked through the kitchen behind Jay and into the living room from the other side. They stood next to Anna. David was beginning to lose his temper and told Jay, "Give the ball to Fern now." Jay responded by saying, "Or what?" David shot to his feet and walked toward Jay. As he did, he told Jay to give the ball to him. Jay refused. David walked right up to Jay and attempted to grab the ball from Jay's hand. Jay resisted. He pulled back, and David did the same. The two struggled to wrest the ball from each other for a few moments. David made eye contact with Jay and could see a rage and hate that he had not seen in his eyes before. Then Jay pulled back on the ball with all the force he could. He hit David in the groin with an elbow strike. David winced at the pain, but at the same time, he saw red. He ripped the ball from Jay's hands and attempted to get his arms around him. Fred had been sitting on the couch next to Anna and became agitated with the situation. He leapt from the couch and charged at Jay and David. David saw Fred coming, and just as Fred was about to attack Jay, David pushed Jay against the wall with his left arm and raised his right arm into Fred's path. Fred chomped down on David's arm, and as David shouted his name and told him, "No, Fred!" Fred immediately released David. Anna called Fred, and the dog returned to her, but continued to bark viciously at the situation. As David dealt with Fred, Jay managed to catch his uncle off balance and push him away from the wall. David's fight or flight instincts kicked in, and he slipped behind Jay and placed him into a rear naked choke. Jay struggled and once again knocked his uncle off balance. The two stumbled down the hall and into the bathroom door. The door was closed but not latched, so when they hit it, it flung open. The two stumbled into the bathroom and into the vanity. Jay had his uncle pinned with his back to the vanity, but David still had him in the rear naked choke. Jay attempted to escape his uncle's grasp by pushing back against the vanity and repeatedly stepping forward and slamming David back against the vanity. After a few attempts, Jay still struggled, but he made a gurgling noise. When David heard that, he snapped out of the red daze for a moment and remembered that it was his teenage nephew that he was choking out. He released Jay's throat and adjusted his grip into a head and arm lock and used his upper body strength to push Jay forward and himself away from the vanity. David was too strong for Jay, and he regained his balance and pushed Jay out of the bathroom, across the hall, and into his bedroom. Once in Jay's bedroom, Jay decided to get one more attempt at besting his uncle, and he twisted and squirmed to get out of his uncle's grip. It was all in vain, however, as David regained his mental composure and reverted to his MMA training. As Jay squirmed, David shifted his position and took Jay to the ground. David pivoted his hips and shifted to a side mount position, converting the head and arm lock into an anaconda choke. Jay still squirmed, but the movement was restricted by David's position. David was not clenching down on the chokehold. Initially, he was only using it to restrain his nephew. Jay started kicking and flailing his free arm in an attempt to escape, but David had his hands locked together and his grip would not be broken. Jay managed to stretch and kick his uncle in the back of the head, slightly dazing him, but David managed to maintain his hold. Jay then began to call his uncle all manner of profane names and insults. David held him and asked him if he was finished with his behavior. Jay would not let up, however, and continued to shout insults at his uncle and flail around. David began to lose his composure again, and his anger began to win. Jay called his uncle a bitch, and David tightened the chokehold. Jay insulted his uncle again, and David again tightened his grip. Jay pretended to go unconscious. David released with one hand and lightly slapped Jay's face a few times, revealing his ruse. Jay struggled, and David regained his grip and asked his nephew if he really wanted to continue this. Jay called his uncle a bitch again, and David squeezed like the snake for which the choke was named. This time, Jay went out for real. David released his grip and stood up. Anna was standing in the doorway. David walked around her and into the bathroom. He filled the toothbrush cup with water from the bathroom sink and returned to Jay's room. Jay was stirring, but was obviously still in a confused state. David dumped the water onto Jay's face. Jay sat up and shook his head. He looked up at his uncle. David leaned down and got into Jay's face and told him, "Don't you ever try that shit again." David straightened back up and turned to leave the room. Anna stepped back into the hallway, and as David exited Jay's room, he looked back at him and told him he was grounded to his bedroom for a week. Then he walked out and closed the door. As soon as the door closed, Jay began to scream and bawl. David and Anna returned to the living room, and Fern had gone to their room. The family pretended to go back to having a normal evening, as Jay screamed and cried at a variety of incoherency and pounded on the walls for hours. When Jay first moved in with the Sanchez's, it seemed like he and Tina were getting pretty close. They often spent time together playing video games, talking about friends, and making videos for social media. But more recently, Tina had withdrawn from Jay. When Anna attempted to ask her about it, she tried to say nothing was wrong and avoided the subject. Anna knew her daughter well, though, and she could tell when Tina was uncomfortable, because something was bothering her. Given their previous discussions, she decided to follow up on it. Despite the incident with the basketball, the family had seemingly moved on. Jay acted as if it never happened and moved on to his next obsession. He claimed that he wanted to design a clothing line. Tina was at her father's when the incident with the basketball took place, and although the other kids had told her about it, not seeing it herself, she didn't pass any judgment on anyone about it. In fact, she almost seemed oblivious to it. Anna knew that it couldn't be the reason for Tina's withdrawal from Jay, and since Tina wasn't the type to really do that to anyone, Anna decided it was important to find out the truth about why she and Jay were no longer hanging out. The first thing Anna realized that she had to do was she needed to start paying attention again when Jay spoke to her about things. Over time, Anna had become so annoyed with Jay's constant interruptions, wanting to talk about things she considered asinine, that she now would tune him out every time he came to her to tell her something. She thought to herself that she wasn't a complete bitch about it. She'd at least let him get to the subject matter. As soon as she found out that it was about friends or social media, however, she would turn to just nodding her head and saying things like, "Oh really?" and "Wow, that's crazy," at random times during Jay's ramblings, so he'd think she was paying attention. Now that she was once again paying attention, she quickly remembered why she had started ignoring him. She hoped that somewhere in his nonsense she'd find out why Tina had become so withdrawn. Not just to Jay, but the entire family. It took a few days to piece together some common ground in his rants, but Anna finally managed to do it. Anna realized that Jay had few friends of his own. There was a boy from the group home that he still spoke to, and a friend from the public school he had been expelled from that he had reconnected with. Other than that, Anna realized that most of the people Jay mentioned were friends of Fern and Tina. Anna thought that was a bit unusual. Jay never mentioned anyone from his charter school except for teachers and counselors. He didn't seem to be making any friends there. Anna wondered why. After paying attention to his banter for a few days, Anna realized a few more things. He often spoke of his conversations with his past friends becoming awkward. He would say things or make comments to them and they would stop messaging him back. Then he would complain about it. After giving some time, he would contact them again and badger them until they finally responded. Then things would get awkward again and the cycle would repeat. Anna hated the thought of snooping on the kids, but when she felt it was genuinely necessary, she would go digging, and this seemed like a necessary situation. When Jay first arrived, he had no phone, no email, no social media. He said his father didn't allow it, so he'd never had any of them. David and Anna had allowed him the freedom to use social media. They couldn't really afford to buy him a phone, so Anna gave him an old one that she still had from a past upgrade. It was old, but it still worked, and Jay seemed happy to have one. He also used his tablet for social media. One thing Jay did not do until it became necessary for school was to set up an email. Instead, he had used Anna's email and phone number to set up his social media accounts. As a result, anytime he was logged out of his social media, he required Anna's help to log back in. He didn't realize that this gave Anna access to all of his accounts. With all that had happened since Jay arrived, it wasn't hard for Anna to convince herself to look through to see if she could find anything else. Anna waited for a day when Jay was attending school in person, so there was no risk of him walking in on her while she was logged into one of his accounts. As she went through them, she remembered that some of the apps delete some communications after a certain amount of time, so she couldn't check messages in those. She could, however, look through his list of who he followed and his followers. While doing this, she quickly discovered that he had very few followers. Each account was the same for the most part. His list consisted of his friends from the group home, his friend from his old public school, 3 young girls with whom he shared a last name, and Tina. His list of who he followed, however, was much more lengthy. He followed hundreds of accounts of other teens, mostly girls. Anna remembered that Jay had once asked her and David for advice on how to talk to girls. They thought it was cute and tried to help out. They assumed that he had met a young lady at school, and given the little history with girls they knew if he had, they felt it was innocent. However, after clicking on a few messages that Jay had sent some of the girls he followed on social media, Anna quickly realized that he was employing the tactics they had given him online. On first, Anna didn't click on many of the sent messages, but the few she did, the girls did not respond to Jay. Anna noticed that he did try to utilize some of the advice her and David had given, but when Jay did it, it came across very creepy. Anna kept digging and found out that most of these young people that Jay followed were spread out across the country, but a few were local, and they were all friends of Fern's and Tina's. Anna thought it was a bit odd that Jay was following all of his cousin's friends. He acted as if they were his friends. There were lengthy chat threads on the apps that stored them. The conversations were also a bit off. Jay spoke to his cousin's friends about them all the time, sometimes seemingly nice things like gift suggestions or advice on how to deal with something. But more often than not, he talked trash about his cousins with their friends. After reading these messages, Anna decided to take a second look at some of the others. She checked some of the more recent message threads with the random girls. In many of these, Jay had thrown his aunt and uncle's advice completely out the window. Some of them were very misogynistic and inappropriate. After scrolling through for a bit, Anna finally came to a message thread between Jay and Tina. Most of the messages were exchanged while Tina was at her father's house. Evidently, there had been a boy that Tina had admired. Jay had apparently befriended him on social media, like the others. In the chat thread, Tina and Jay talked about the boy. It was a lengthy thread, and a lot had happened that Anna wasn't aware of. Jay had offered to help Tina score points with the boy by befriending him on social media. At some point, things didn't go well, and Tina blamed it on something that Jay had said to the boy. This had led to a rather bitter argument between them. Anna convinced herself that this must be the reason Tina had become so reserved lately, and why her and Jay had stopped hanging out and speaking altogether. Anna thought it best if she stopped snooping and logged out of all the apps. She wondered why Tina had not mentioned what happened to her. Tina had always been very open with Anna about everything. Anna set her tablet down and heard Fred barking at the front door open. Jay was home from school early. Anna got up from the chair in her bedroom and walked out to the kitchen area. Jay was still saying hello to Fred in the doorway of the living room. He called out hello to her. When Jay was finished playing with Fred, he met Anna in the kitchen. He was carrying a skateboard under his arm. Anna asked where he got it. Jay told her that the skateboard company had given his charter school 3 to give away randomly. His name had been drawn out of a hat by the principal to receive one. Anna congratulated him, as she could see that he was genuinely excited about it. Jay then asked her if the next time his allowance check came in, he could use it to buy some clothes and accessories for what was apparently going to be his latest passion, skateboarding. Anna told him that he would need to speak with his uncle about that when he arrived home from work. Jay agreed and went to his room. Later that afternoon, David arrived home. He approached the front door and shook his head as the security door was ajar, as always. He opened the door and Fred attacked him with excitement and love. David was barely inside the door and trying to get Fred to calm down when Jay came running out of the hallway, just as excited as Fred, with his new skateboard in his hands. David got Fred to sit and was petting him to calm him when he asked Jay where the skateboard had come from. Jay repeated the story he had told Anna earlier. After the tale, David tilted his head in a surprised manner and congratulated Jay on his win as well. As David made his way around into the dining room, he set down his backpack and hung up his hat and keys. Jay followed him anxiously, and David could tell that he had something to ask him. David asked Jay what it was, and Jay excitedly asked him the same thing he had asked Anna. Jay was not, however, prepared for David's response. After Jay asked to use the allowance, David replied to him, "What allowance? We don't give you an allowance. We can barely pay the bills." Jay looked confused. Then he told David that he was referring to the check that came every month from the state and the Department of Child Safety for him. David walked over to the refrigerator and took a beer out of it. He stepped over to the countertop, opened the beer, took a drink. Then he set the can down on the counter. Jay took a stance across the counter from him, the breakfast bar area, and awaited another response from his uncle. David stared at Jay for a moment. He took another drink from his beer and set it back down. He looked at Jay again and asked him how he knew about the check from the state in the first place. Jay replied that when he was in the group home, he got one every month. He said that the staff would cash it for him and turn it over to him when it came. He said that he figured that it was still receiving a check now that he lived with the Sanchez's, but that he hadn't felt the need to ask for the money. David took another drink of his beer and set it back down. He took a deep breath and sighed. Then he began to explain things to Jay. He told Jay that they did indeed receive a check from the state every month for him. He explained to Jay, however, that he was mistaken in its purpose. He told him that it was very generous of the group home to give him cash every month from the check, but that it was something they didn't have to do. Jay stared at his uncle, confused. David further explained that the actual intention for the check was to assist David and Anna to provide him with the things he needed financially. He told Jay that yes, it was intended to buy him things like clothing, but that it was also meant to help pay for things like food, healthcare, schooling expenses, and even utility bills. He explained that adding a person to the household drives all monthly expenses up, and that check was to assist David and Anna with those expenses. He tried to explain that it was not an allowance the way kids usually think of it, and that the money from it went toward keeping the family supported. Jay still appeared to be confused. He questioned David's explanation, stating that his caseworker referred to it as his allowance herself. David tried again to explain to Jay that it was called an allowance, but that it wasn't meant to go directly to him. Jay asked what it was for, as if he had just ignored everything that David told him. David began to feel irritated. He again explained everything to Jay the way he had before, but using more remedial terminology. Jay was now visibly frustrated and began to raise his voice at his uncle, demanding that he receive some of his allowance. He then told David that he knew the check from the state was for over $1,000 a month, and that it wasn't fair that he didn't get any of it. David defended himself by telling Jay that he was mistaken about the amount of the check. He explained that the group home gets more than private foster families. He told Jay that it really wasn't any of his business to decide what he thought, but he assured him that the monthly check was only for about $200. Jay's eyes welled up with tears and he began questioning David and Anna's usage of the funds the state allotted for his care. He complained that he hadn't gotten any of the new clothes, and that he was never able to buy any snacks or beverages that he liked. He complained about not being able to dye or cut his hair whenever he wanted to because he didn't have any money. He complained about a variety of other monetary things, but David had enough and stopped him in his rant. He told him that if he wanted spending money, then he was old enough to get a part-time job and earn it himself. David asked Jay what he thought living with the Sanchez's would be like. He asked Jay what he expected when he found out he could stay with them. Jay fought to hold back tears. David yelled at Jay, asking him if he expected to be spoiled and get everything he wanted like a little brat, like he was acting like. Jay was quiet for a moment, and then he answered David's question simply by saying, "Yes." Jay then began to shout something indecipherable, and David shouted over him to shut his mouth and go to his room. Jay got quiet and glared at his uncle. David advised him to go to his room before he ended up being grounded again. Jay went to his room and slammed the door. David saw red and heard Jay's door open again. Jay quickly apologized, claiming that he had not intended to slam the door. David did his best to calm himself. Then he gulped down the rest of his beer and walked to his bedroom, where he found Anna sitting in the chair, waiting for him. David closed the bedroom door behind him, and Anna told him that she had eavesdropped on the entire conversation he just had with Jay. She told David that she had also tried to explain the way state allocation worked, but that Jay did not want to hear it from her. She told David that Jay was beginning to act more and more like a male chauvinist. She said that she hadn't really paid attention until that day. David asked if there were any specific examples of things he had done, but Anna explained that it wasn't like he had gone out of his way to do anything. It was the little things, rather, that Jay was doing. Anna noticed that whenever she spoke to Jay, he would completely tune her out and stop listening. It didn't matter who had begun the conversation either. He had brought up a few things to her earlier for discussion, and then ignored her when she began to speak. She had even tested him once by stating nonsense to see if he was paying attention, and he was not. Anna then admitted to David that she had snooped around on Jay's social media accounts. She told him that she felt there were things about Jay that she did not know. She told David about what had taken place with the boy that Tina had liked. She told David that she wasn't sure, but she had a feeling that Jay had actually sabotaged Tina's efforts with the young man, rather than aid her. She apologized to David, but told him that she was beginning to feel like they had made a mistake by taking Jay in. David hung his head as he gathered a change of clothes out of his dresser. He let out a low sigh and told Anna that he agreed with her. He turned toward her and apologized to her, stating that he realized he hadn't yet given her a kiss since arriving home. They stepped toward each other and kissed. Then Anna pulled back and looked up at David. She asked him if he'd already had a beer to drink. He nodded and told her that he had chugged one while talking to Jay. Anna took a step back, and David could tell she was concerned. He apologized to her and told her that he just needed something to ease the edge when he walked in the door, and Jay immediately bombarded him. Anna told David that she understood. Then she turned and walked over to the little writing desk they had in the corner of the bedroom. She picked an empty wine glass up off the table and showed it to David, shaking it playfully with a smirk on her face. David smiled and shook his head. He told Anna that it probably wasn't good they were both drinking this way. She agreed and told him that they should be careful and keep an eye on each other. One morning, the family woke to something completely unexpected. Puck and Checkers liked to use Fred's doggy door to go outside. The family would allow the cats to come and go as they pleased. This particular morning, Puck had decided to be nice and bring in a present for Fern. A present in the form of a live mockingbird. David and Anna woke to the sounds of Fern shouting profanities at Puck. After a few seconds of grogginess cleared, they realized they could also hear the squawks of a bird inside the house. As the entire family converged on Fern's room, Tina was the first to arrive and found Fern standing on top of their bed. The bird hopped out from under the bed for a moment, and Tina screamed and jumped on the bed with Fern. Tina's reaction startled the bird, and it attempted to fly but ended up back underneath the bed. David and Anna arrived in the room to ask what was happening, and Jay walked up behind them. Puck darted under the bed, and the mockingbird began to squawk and chirp loudly as the cat growled. David got down on the floor and reached under the bed. He grabbed Puck by the scruff, and the cat released the bird from his mouth. David handed Puck to Fern and told him to hold on to him. David then told Jay to be ready. He said he was going to chase the bird out from under the bed. David looked under the bed, and the bird had backed itself all the way into the corner. David had crawled partially under the bed, which was a very tight squeeze, so that he could reach the bird to flush it out. As he did, he called out to Jay to be ready, because the bird was coming out. David grabbed a rolled-up poster that Fern had under the bed and reached at the bird with it, shooing it out from under the bed. As the bird fluttered its wings and hopped out from under the bed, David watched as Fern's skateboard came smashing down on it. The bird flopped around on the floor as the skateboard struck the bird over and over again. The bird let out a spine-chilling squawk just before the skateboard came crashing down on its head. A low popping noise could be heard, and David's face was splashed with blood as he attempted to crawl out from under the bed. As he got out, he could now see that it was Jay holding the skateboard. He had finally stopped striking the bird with it. Fern, Tina, and Anna all screamed with disbelief as it all happened. It all happened so fast that David was in shock. He just laid on the floor for a moment, looking up at Jay, who was giggling. Fern had redirected their obscenities to Jay, and Tina had joined in the fray. David picked himself off the floor and used his t-shirt to wipe the blood splatter from his face. He looked over at Anna, who stared back at him in disbelief at what had just happened. Fern shouted at Jay to give them their skateboard as they continued to hold Puck in one arm. Jay looked up at Fern and handed them the skateboard. David left the room and came back with a plastic shopping bag. He used the bag to pick up the bird carcass, and he asked Fern and Tina to quiet down. When the two calmed themselves, David asked Jay why he had done what he had done. Jay's grin changed to a look of confusion, and he asked his uncle what he meant. David then asked Jay specifically why he had killed the bird. Jay appeared dumbfounded and replied that David had told him to. David quickly corrected Jay, telling him that he had told him to be ready. He had meant for him to catch the bird so they could put it outside. He said that he thought that he should have been a parent, but admitted that he was wrong. David looked around at the rest of the family. They all had terrified looks on their faces after what had just happened. Jay acted like it was no big deal. He defended his actions, saying that he figured the bird was going to die anyway after being attacked by the cat. He said he was trying to put it out of its misery. David looked into his nephew's eyes as he was saying this and realized that Jay truly believed in what he was saying. He thought he was doing the bird a favor, and he showed no regret or remorse about it. David told Jay that if it happened again, they would try to save the bird next time. He declared to the whole room that no animals are to be killed without reason in this household. Then he left the room, not knowing what else to say, and went outside to put the bagged bird into the garbage. He stood out there by the garbage for an unusual amount of time. After placing the dead bird in the trash can, he couldn't help but think about the old serial killer stereotype. The one about how they always start with animals. He thought about the bird. He thought about the joyous look on Jay's face when they put down Iris. He thought about his cousin JD's dog. Then he thought about Puck. He wondered if the family pets were in danger. Was Jay doing things to them when no one was around? Fred didn't seem to spend much time with Jay anymore. He would still greet him at the door when he came home from school, but he didn't follow Jay around and play with him like he used to. David was deep in thought about the things he was now considering, and suddenly he was startled by a male voice asking if he was all right. He jumped a little and turned to see his neighbor, Mac, standing on his front porch. He appeared to be fixing something on his front door. Mac laughed when David jumped and apologized for scaring him. Then he asked David again if he was all right. David replied yes, that he was okay, and Mac commented that he appeared lost in thought. David told Mac that he was right and that he currently had a lot on his mind. He joked that the kids were driving him crazy, and Mac replied by joking that he couldn't help with that, having never had any children of his own. Mac then pointed toward the front door of the Sanchez house and commented that he saw the security screen door the way it currently was more often than not. David turned to see what Mac was referring to and saw that he had left the screen door ajar when he came outside, the way he almost always found it when he got home from work. Mac sarcastically commented that the security door can't do its job if it's always open. Then he pointed at what he was working on and told David to consider installing what he was. David took a closer look and saw that Mac was installing a doorbell camera. He told Mac that probably would be a good idea and that he had taken into consideration. Then Mac asked David why the boy never rides a skateboard. Confused by the question, David asked Mac to clarify. Mac told him that he frequently saw Fern and Tina riding their longboards around the neighborhood, but that Jay usually carried his skateboard when he was out. David asked Mac to elaborate, and Mac said that he would see Jay get on the skateboard and wobble to the end of the cul-de-sac. Then he would usually pick up his skateboard and walk wherever he was headed from there. This confused David more. Jay would sometimes ask to ride a skateboard around the neighborhood, or to ride it down to the neighborhood convenience store. Was Mac now telling David that all those times he never actually rode the board? Did Jay even know how to ride? There were a lot of things about Jay that David was beginning to wonder about. David thanked his neighbor for the conversations and went back inside the house. Tina and Fern were now sitting at the dining room table while Anna made coffee. David asked Anna where Jay was, and she told him that he was in his bedroom. Apparently, he had begun to throw a fit over getting scolded for killing the bird, and while David was outside, he stormed to his room and closed the door. Anna asked David what took him so long outside, and David told her that he had run into their neighbor, Mac, while he was out there. He told her what Mac had said about Jay and his skateboard, and Anna looked at David confused. She stated that Jay went out with his skateboard all the time, and David responded that apparently he was not riding it. David then thought of something he had not before. He asked Anna if Jay always came back with something from the convenience store when he went. Anna replied that he usually had a fountain drink and a bag of some variety of hot chips or one of those nasty cookies and cream candy bars that he liked so much when he returned. David then asked Anna rhetorically, where was Jay getting the money from to make these purchases? Anna thought for a moment and realized she had no answer. At first, Jay asked for the occasional $2 to $5, which she had happily given him, but he hadn't done that in quite some time. Anna had just come to that realization. David and Anna had been standing next to the kitchen sink having their discussion, and had forgotten that Fern and Tina were sitting at the dining room table. Tina alerted them to the fact, and they had relocated closer to join the conversation by saying, "Mom?" David and Anna both looked over to see Fern and Tina standing across the breakfast bar from them. Tina continued once she had their attention. She told them that Jay had been making her uncomfortable for a while. Anna had a feeling that she was about to finally find out what had been bothering Tina, and she was correct. Tina went on to explain that Jay had attempted to befriend all of her friends on social media. She said that not all of them had accepted, but many had. Anna and David already knew this, of course, due to Anna's previous snooping, but they pretended to act surprised. Tina went on to say that there was one boy in particular that Jay had befriended that bothered her. She admitted that she had a crush on the boy at one time, but Jay had ruined everything for her. Anna made eye contact with David, and the two both knew this was the incident that Anna had discovered. They were finally going to get some of the details that they were curious about. Tina paused for a moment out of embarrassment, but Anna urged her to continue. Fern looked down the hallway to ensure that Jay was not listening. His door was still closed. Tina further explained that Jay had offered to help her win the boy over by befriending him in an attempt to learn about his interests through some quote-unquote guy chat. Tina had agreed, but unfortunately, things took several turns against her. She explained that first Jay overwhelmed the boy with messages, which made it difficult for her to chat with him as Jay was always catching him online. She said that the information that Jay gathered was useless to her and served him instead. The boy ended up playing video games online with Jay as well. All this had led to the boy practically ignoring Tina. Tina went on to say that at one point she decided she'd had enough and confronted Jay about it. Jay apologized for it and all stated that he just thought the boy was a great guy and was happy to make friends with him as well. He offered to back off and return to their original plan, believing his intentions sincere. Tina had once again agreed. It wasn't long, however, before once again it backfired on her. She claimed that instead of backing off, Jay furthered his intentions to make the boy his friend. He directly told the boy about Tina's crush and had even teased him about it. Tina claimed that when the boy showed that he was interested in her as well, Jay's tone completely changed. Evidently, he took a different approach to his communications with the boy. He had apparently adopted a protective demeanor. Tina claimed that Jay had even gone so far as to threaten the boy, stating that if he hurt his cousin, he'd hurt him. Tina said that at that point, the boy withdrew from both of them, refusing to return either of their messages and blocking them on social media. Tina continued to explain that she had again decided to confront Jay, but this time things were entirely different. She claimed that Jay took offense to what she said this time. He tried to blame her for the fact that the boy stopped talking to them, saying that the boy had even blocked him. Tina said that Jay became very angry at her accusations to the point that she began to fear he was going to attack her. She said that at that point, she backed off, went to her room, and hadn't really spoken to Jay since. Anna and David attempted to comfort Tina, assuring her that they were aware something was wrong and that they were looking out. Despite not knowing what it was, they told Tina not to worry about Jay, that they would handle anything that may arise. David told Fern and Tina that he was about to make breakfast and that the two of them should go clean up and try to clear their morning's events from their minds before they sat down to eat. The two agreed and walked down the hallway to their respective rooms. David looked at Anna and told her he thought that she should do her thing a little more. She looked at him confused for a moment and then asked him what he meant. He replied, You know, that Sherlock Holmes stuff you do on the internet. Why don't you see what else you can find out about what we haven't been told? Mother's Day was approaching, and Suzanne stopped by the Sanchez home for her monthly visit with Jay. She asked him how school and his therapy appointments were going, and as usual, he didn't have much more to say other than, fine. Anna and David had basically stopped paying attention to his schooling as they had given up trying to get him to do it. His counseling appointments were now done over the phone, so they weren't around for those either. After Suzanne finished going through her usual visit checklist, she told Anna, David, and Jay that she wanted to speak to them about something. She told them that enough time had passed since she was last able to contact Jay's biological father, combined with the fact that he had not attended the last few court dates concerning Jay's case. She told them that the state was going through with severing his parental rights and putting Jay up for adoption. She explained to them that, unlike their previous case with Fern, whom they still only had legal guardianship over, the state felt that it would be in Jay's best interest. The Sanchez's adopted him. Jay appeared immediately excited at the prospect. David and Anna, however, looked at each other with concern and doubt. Suzanne could sense their apprehension and told them that the process would not be immediate. It would still take a few months to get court dates, and there were several legal documents that needed to be exchanged. She assured them that they had some time to discuss and adjust to it. Suzanne then told them that the next day she'd be by and gather her things on the way out the door. She told David and Anna that she was very excited for Jay, and she was glad things were going so well for them all. As Suzanne left, David closed the front door behind her and turned to Anna. She wanted to say something, but he slightly shook his head, signaling her that Jay was standing behind her. The two both turned toward Jay, who was smiling. He told them that he was excited about the prospect of adoption. Then he scurried off to his room, waving his arms and shouting about telling his friends like a child half his age. When they heard his door close, David asked Anna what she wanted to say. As he expected, she told him that she felt bad about it, but that she was very leery about adopting Jay. David told her that he agreed. He said that being his legal guardian, while the Department of Child Safety maintained custody, was one thing, but a legal adoption would mean a lot more legal responsibility and obligation. With some of the recent issues they had with Jay, David wasn't sure if he was willing to accept that. Anna then told David that she had more to tell him, but suggested that they go to their bedroom and close the door to discuss it. When they got to the room, David closed the door as Anna sat on the bed. David took a seat next to her in the chair, and she took out her phone. She explained that she had done what David had suggested and did some more snooping on social media that had led her to some interesting coincidences. She asked David if he knew that Jay had 3 other sisters. He had a younger sister from his mother and father who was in someone else's custody, but Anna was referring to the 3 girls who shared his last name on his social media profiles. David told her that he knew Jay's father had at least one other child because he'd actually met her when Jay's father and David's sister first began dating. He told her that the girl had to be in her 20s. Anna confirmed that the girl was 22 years old. She then informed him that the other 2 girls were also Jay's sisters. They were 20 and 19 years old, respectively. David told her that he was unaware of those 2. Anna explained that she had read some text between all of them and Jay, when she had learned that all 3 of them had lived with their mothers and that their father was not involved in their lives. She said she was able to deduce that Jay had not always been in contact with them. Rather, it seemed like he was trying to establish bonds with them now and was using the father abandonment issue to forge a bond. David added that if Jay's father was a serial deadbeat dad, it would explain some of his issues. Anna nodded her head in agreement and told David that she had more. Anna then asked David if he recalled the story Jay had told him about his expulsion from public school. David said that he did. He had harassed some girls and something about rock throwing. Anna confirmed and told him that she had pieced this one together from several different text message threads and emails that Jay had traded with his 3 sisters and 2 friends. She said she had also found a few articles online. It turned out that Jay had a crush on the girl who he was expelled for harassing. David pointed out that this was probably obvious considering Jay's approach toward girls. Anna went on to say that she had put together the story of what had really happened. Jay and his friend were walking to school, and on the way, they had encountered the girl that Jay was crushing on, and a friend of hers. As they were approaching the school, Jay's friend had dared him to get her attention. Jay began calling the girls by name. After the girls ignored him, he decided to throw a rock at them. Unfortunately, he hit the girl's friend in the back of the head. Luck was a little on his side that day. Jay had only picked up a small decorative landscaping rock, and the girl was wearing a hair clip that took the brunt of the damage. She did still, however, require some stitches. Anna further explained that the girl's uncle happened to be a man named Victor Wolf. Mr. Wolf was the president of the Greenhaven Country Club and was known for his political influence. He had apparently threatened the school district with a lawsuit if Jay were not expelled. David acknowledged that this was crazy information to learn, but he stated that he wasn't sure what it really had to do with Jay's behavior. Anna admitted that she really didn't either, but she told David that there was more. She told David that she learned from a message to one of his sisters that after the incident, Jay had been checked into an inpatient behavioral health clinic. He had apparently stayed there for a few months before being released. A few weeks after that was when he had moved in with David's cousin, JD. David then interjected that the incident with the dog occurred to get him kicked out of JD's, which is when he was placed into state custody and moved into the group home. Anna concurred and told David that this is where another strange coincidence occurred. Anna reminded David about the young man who had been found dead in the high desert with the 3 others they had seen on the news. The one Jay had said was a staff member at his group home. David declared that he remembered. Anna continued by saying that Jay had a conversation with his friend at the group home about it, and after finding that she had done some research and found that it was true. The strangest part was the young man's uncle was Victor Wolf. David stood perplexed for a moment and then admitted this was another very odd coincidence. Anna then stated that she still wasn't finished. She told David that the Victor Wolf connection led her to look up the Greenhaven Country Club. She showed a picture on her phone of David of the Greenhaven Country Club board of directors. She told him to make note of the vice president. She then showed David another picture. It was a group photo taken at the country club holiday social event. The photo featured all of the members of the board of directors with their spouses. David scanned through the photo for the vice president, assuming that it was what Anna wanted. He wasn't prepared for what he saw when he found him. Standing next to the vice president was his wife, Suzanne. David's face went pale and Anna could sense how he felt. She attempted to comfort him by saying, "I know, right?" David had no idea what to think of these connections. He told Anna that he still wasn't sure what all this had to do with Jay's behavior, though. Anna again admitted that neither did she, but that she felt in her gut that it was all somehow related. David attempted to process the information and told Anna that he thought he should call his cousin JD again to try to get him to tell him the full story of what happened with the dog. Anna agreed that it was a good idea, saying that she had noticed Fred had started behaving oddly around Jay. David told her that he noted that as well. David told Anna that he would call JD that evening, as he knew that he worked until late afternoon. David looked at Anna and smirked. He asked her, "Tell me again why you're not a cop?" She replied, "Because my father is." Then he changed the subject, asking her if they needed to make a trip to the grocery store. Meanwhile, across the hall, Jay sat on a chair in his room, his elbows resting on the armrest, his hands clasped together. He trembled, his tears of rage ran down his cheeks. David and Anna did not realize that when they talked in their room, Jay could hear every word they said through the central air vents. Jay stood up and walked to the door of his room. He opened the door and walked down the hallway to the kitchen. He looked around to make sure he was alone in the kitchen, and then he opened one of the kitchen drawers, the drawer with the medicine in it. From the drawer, he retrieved one of Anna's inhalers, and he pressed it, spraying out the content. He pressed it again, and again, and again. A little later that morning, Fern and Tina asked David and Anna if they could go longboarding. The two liked to dress up and longboard around the neighborhood. That day's ride didn't go as well as usual, though. The two didn't get very far when suddenly Fern had trouble with their board. As the two tried to turn around a corner, Fern's board began to wobble. They tried their best to regain balance and control, but to no avail. As Fern rounded the corner, something caught the board's wheels, and Fern fell, hitting the back of their head on the curb. Unfortunately, Fern and Tina, like most kids, never wore a helmet or protective gear while riding through the neighborhood. Tina laughed at first, as most people tend to do when seeing something like that happen, but she quickly got serious when she realized that Fern had hurt themselves. Tina hopped off her board and ran over to Fern to check on them. There was no blood, so that was good, and Fern seemed coherent, but did say that their head was hurting. After giving a few moments for recovery, Tina was able to get Fern on their feet, and the two walked back home. When the two got home, David and Anna were in the kitchen. Anna thought it odd that they had returned so soon and asked if they were all right. Tina told them what happened, and David hurried over to look over Fern's head. He found no cuts or blood, but did find a small knot. He asked Fern if they felt dizzy or nauseated or if their vision was blurred. Fern replied no, that it just hurt. David and Anna helped Fern to their bedroom to continue the observation, and whilst they attended to them, Tina decided to make some ramen noodles. Tina took the package of noodles from the pantry and broke them up into a bowl. She filled it halfway with water and put it into the microwave. Despite being tall for her age, Tina had trouble reaching the microwave as it sat on a high shelf above the oven. As she set the timer, Anna called Tina's name, and she went to Fern's bedroom to respond. Jay had been in his room the entire time, and he was listening to the commotion through the vents. When Tina got to Fern's room, he snuck out of his room and into the kitchen. He looked around, nervously, to make sure no one was around. Then he took a drinking glass from the cupboard and filled it with water. He walked over to the microwave and opened the door. He took the bowl out and filled it to the brim with water. He carefully placed the bowl back into the microwave, closed the door, and reset the timer. Then he picked up the glass, which still had water in it, and went back to his room and closed the door. A few minutes later, Tina left Fern's room while David and Anna continued to attend to them. She got back to the kitchen as the timer on the microwave ended. She took a spoon out of the drawer and placed it onto the countertop, and she opened another drawer and took out 2 pot holders. She opened the microwave and grasped the bowl with both hands, using the pot holders. The extra weight from the added water came unexpected, as did the level to which the bowl was filled. As she attempted to retrieve the bowl from the microwave, the water spilled over one side and onto her right hand. As the scalding hot water ran over her hand, Tina screamed in pain and jumped back, dropping and shattering the bowl. As soon as Anna heard the scream, Mama Bear was in the kitchen so fast it was as if she had teleported. She saw the bowl and asked what happened. Tina showed her hand to her mother, and it was bright red and beginning to blister. David was in the room right after Anna. He took Tina by the injured arm and led her to the sink, turning on the cold water. He told Tina to let the water run over her hand for a few minutes. Then he looked at Anna and told her that they should probably take both Tina and Fern to the emergency room for evaluation. Anna agreed and went to her room to fetch her shoes and purse. David gathered his phone, wallet, and car keys. He walked down the hall and told Fern they were all going to the hospital and asked if they were okay to walk. Fern confirmed, and David told them to go wait with Tina in the kitchen while he told Jay they were leaving. He walked over to Jay's bedroom door, knocked, and opened it. Jay was sitting on his bed, using his tablet. David told him that everyone else was going to the emergency room and that they may be gone a while. Jay asked why they were going, and David told him that Fern had hit their head and Tina had burned herself. Jay proclaimed, "Oh no!" And David instantly sensed his false concern. He told Jay they'd be back and closed his door. He met up with Fern, Tina, and Anna in the kitchen, and the family all went out to the car together and left for the hospital. Later that afternoon, the family returned from the hospital. Fern had a mild concussion from their fall, and Tina's burns on their hand were second degree. As the family got into the house and the kids settled into their rooms for the rest, Jay came out of his room and asked David if it were okay for him to ride a skateboard to the neighborhood convenience store. David was tired at this point and didn't care that it was getting late in the afternoon and told him it was fine. A short time later, David was busy preparing dinner for the family and drinking a beer when Jay returned home. He came through the front door with a distraught look on his face and entered the kitchen to talk to David. David looked at him, and upon seeing his face, he asked what was wrong. Jay burst into tears, and it took him a few moments to regain his composure to tell his uncle that his skateboard had been stolen from him at the convenience store. David turned off the stove and walked over to grab his keys. He told Jay to go with him, and Jay followed him out to the car. The two got into the car, and David began driving toward the convenience store. During the short ride, David told Jay to explain to him what had happened. Jay told him that a group of young men had surrounded him and demanded his skateboard and backpack, which he gave them out of fear of being jumped. David asked him to describe the young men, but Jay claimed he could not do so, stating that his recollection of them was blurred because he had been afraid. He said that he remembered, however, that one of them had been riding a hoverboard. As they turned onto the street that the store was at the end of, David began scanning the sidewalks. Just before reaching the convenience store in the parking lot of the restaurant next to it, David spotted a group of 3 young men. One of them was riding a hoverboard, and another carried Jay's skateboard. David pulled into the parking lot and asked Jay if they were the ones who had surrounded him, and Jay answered, "I think so." David pointed out the one that was carrying the skateboard, and Jay replied, "Oh yeah, that's them." David parked the car and reached underneath his seat. Jay could not see what it was that David had retrieved, as he immediately put it into his back pocket. David got out of the car and shouted at the group of young men. They all turned their attention to him, and David told Jay to remain in the car. He closed the door and approached the group. Jay sat in the car and watched as his uncle spoke to the young men. He could not hear what was being said because the car windows were up. You could see David point at the skateboard, while the one holding it seemed to shake his head in denial. The young man on the hoverboard circled the group as they talked. David looked back and pointed at Jay, and the group all looked in his direction. Jay began to feel anxious. This wasn't going the way he had planned it. He began to sweat, even through the car's air conditioner was blowing hard and cold in his face. David focused his attention back to the young man holding the skateboard. He seemed to shake his head in denial again. Then, as the young man on the hoverboard circled around behind David, he looked over at Jay. Jay saw the young man was holding an aluminum water bottle in his hand, and he knew what was going to happen next. Jay smiled. The young man holding the skateboard was also holding David's attention, as the one on the hoverboard rode up behind David and swung the bottle, striking David in the back of the head. David stumbled forward and into the arms of the young man holding the skateboard, who dropped it and caught David, then pushed him back at the one on the hoverboard. The hoverboarder jumped off his board and grabbed David from behind, wrapping one arm around David's neck in a choke, and then using his other arm to trap David's left arm. The one who had been holding the skateboard then began punching David in the abdomen, while the third young man stood by, cheering the whole thing on. While the young man continued to strike him, David quickly raised his right knee, hitting the young man in the groin. As the young man fell to his knees, David bent at the waist, forcing all of his weight forward. The hoverboarder lost his balance, and his grip loosened enough for David to slip under the headlock and beside the young man. David positioned his right leg behind the hoverboarder and kicked the young man in the back of the knee, while simultaneously reaching up and grabbing the hair on the back of his head. He yanked down, and the hoverboarder hit the ground hard on his back, but his left foot twisted beneath him. The third young man finally decided to get involved, but as he charged at David reached into his back pocket and retrieved the item that he had pulled out from under the seat. Jay watched in horror as his uncle flicked his wrist and a metal baton telescoped open. The third young man took a swing at David, but David ducked beneath the haymaker and swung the baton backward, striking the young man across the back of his neck. The young man yelped in pain and tumbled forward, hitting the pavement face first. As the 3 young men writhed on the ground in agony, Jay watched as his uncle walked over and picked up the skateboard. He walked back to the car, holding the skateboard in one hand, while still holding the extended baton in the other. He got to the car. He opened the back passenger door and tossed the skateboard onto the back seat. Jay watched as David closed the door and walked around the back of the car to the driver's door. David opened the door and got in. He collapsed the baton and put it back under the driver's seat. He closed the door, put on his seatbelt, and began driving back home. When the two arrived back at home, David pulled into the driveway, parked, and turned off the car. He looked at Jay and said, "That happens again? I watch you handle it." Then he got out of the car and went inside. Jay sat in the car and watched his uncle go inside the house. He looked back at his skateboard in the back seat Then his eyes welled up with tears of rage, and he let out a growling yell as he banged his fist on the car seat in frustration. He didn't realize that Fern was watching him through the blinds of their bedroom window. One morning, Anna was awakened to the sound of Fred vomiting in the hallway. David had left for work early that morning, but he usually fed the pets before he left, so Anna was concerned when she heard Fred struggling. She got out of bed and walked to the hallway where Fred greeted her, but she noticed that he wasn't quite acting his normal self. He seemed to be trembling a little, and he whined anxiously. After Fred said his good mornings, he turned and headed for the kitchen, and Anna heard him go out the doggy door. She stepped over the vomit and retrieved a roll of paper towels from the kitchen. She turned on the hallway light, and as she squatted down to clean up the mess, she noticed that the vomit had a strange brown goo in it. She wiped it up, unable to determine what it was, and tossed the towels in the trash. Fred came back through the doggy door and whimpered at Anna. Just as she looked over at him, the golden retriever collapsed and went into a seizure. Anna screamed in panic, and her cries woke the kids. Fern and Tina came rushing into the kitchen to see what was happening. A few moments later, Jay casually made his way to the kitchen as well. When he arrived, Anna, Fern, and Tina were all surrounding Fred, who was still convulsing. They were afraid to touch him. The convulsions stopped, and Fred was still conscious. He whimpered, but he was so weak he could barely be heard. Anna told Fern and Tina to watch him while she got dressed, and she ran to the bedroom. Jay asked Fern and Tina what was wrong, and they told him that Anna had mentioned Fred vomited before this happened, but they didn't know why he was the way he was now. Jay turned and walked back to his bedroom and closed the door. A few short moments later, Anna came running back into the kitchen. She checked to see if Fred would let her touch him, and he did. The dog looked up at her with sad eyes. Anna scooped Fred up into her arms and asked Fern to open the front door and the car door for her. Anna carried Fred outside while Fern led the way and Tina followed. Fern opened the back driver door, and Anna gently laid Fred on the back seat of the car. She told Fern and Tina that she was taking Fred to the emergency veterinarian and that she would keep them updated. She got into the driver's seat, started the car, and drove off as Fern and Tina watched. A short time later, Anna was at the vet's office waiting in an exam room. They had taken Fred to the back on an emergency basis. While she waited, Anna texted David at work to let him know what had happened. He asked if Fred was okay, but she told him she didn't really have any answers for that at this point. Not long later, the veterinarian came back into the exam room to give Anna an update. Anna told him about the brown substance in Fred's vomit when she arrived. The doctor told her they had induced additional vomiting and gotten some more of it, which allowed her to confirm her suspicions. The vet told Anna that Fred had consumed some chocolate. She asked Anna if she had any ideas how he had gotten it. Anna was obviously shocked and stated that she did not. She told the doctor that chocolate wasn't even something that was normally in the house, other than the chocolate syrup that the kids like to put in the milk on top of ice cream. The doctor told Anna that this was most likely not syrup, but that she had definitely ingested some chocolate. She informed Anna that Fred would need to remain overnight for observation due to the seizure. She told Anna that Fred had not had any additional seizures and currently seemed in a little better spirits. She stated it was likely that they were able to get Fred into the office in time to induce vomiting before the chocolate could do any additional harm to him. She told Anna that Fred would probably be okay, but that she wanted to give him fluids and keep an eye on him. Anna agreed, reluctant to leave her baby at the vet, and the doctor asked her to wait a moment for the nurse to bring in some paperwork. Anna thanked the vet and sent a group text to update for Tina and David. Unexpectedly, Anna received a text from Fern. Fern said that after Anna had left for the vet, she told Tina to text her father to pick her up to take her to school. In all the commotion, Anna had completely forgotten that it was a school day and thanked Fern for having Tina do that. Then Fern told her that Jay was supposed to be doing his schoolwork, but instead, he was walking around the house video chatting with his friend from the group home, obnoxiously loud. They said that they had asked him nicely to keep it down as they were attempting to do their schoolwork, but Jay had refused very rudely. Anna let Fern know that she was just waiting on some paperwork and that she would be headed home soon. A while later, Anna pulled into the driveway at home. She got out of the car and went into the house, and as soon as she opened the front door, she could hear Jay talking and laughing very loudly. So loud that she could hear it over the living room TV, which Jay was currently using to play a video game. David had never changed the rule about asking permission to use the video game console. That was in the living room. If David was at work, Jay was supposed to ask Anna. Anna asked Jay what he was doing, but he did not respond. Instead, continued to play while talking to his friend. He had his tablet sitting on the coffee table in front of him, so he could video chat while playing. Anna called out his name, but he again ignored her. Anna was still stressed out about Fred and was on her last nerve, so she decided she wasn't going to take Jay's shenanigans this time. She walked over to the entertainment center and switched off the surge protector that everything was plugged into. The TV turned off, and Jay yelled at Anna, asking what she was doing. Anna quickly replied that she had just asked him that question, but he chose to ignore her, thus leading to her turning everything off. He angrily shouted that it wasn't fair, and she ignored him and asked why he was playing video games instead of doing his schoolwork, and added that he was doing it without permission to use the living room TV. Jay shot back that he'd already done his homework as Anna glanced down at the tablet on the coffee table. She could see Jay's friend covering his mouth and giggling on the screen. She walked over and picked up the tablet. Jay again yelled at her and asked her what she was doing. Again, Anna ignored him and faced the tablet at her. Jay's friend's eyes were wide from shock. Anna said, "Goodbye," and ended the video chat. Jay jumped to his feet and began cursing at her. Fern appeared in the hallway after hearing what was going on. Jay hit Anna with a verbal barrage of curses, and she just let him go for a minute. When she'd had enough, she told him that when he was finished, he'd go to his room and do his schoolwork. Jay again shouted that he'd already done his schoolwork for the day. What he didn't realize is that Anna pulled up his daily syllabus. She held up the tablet so that Jay could see the screen, and he knew right away what she was showing him. The day's assignments were still marked as incomplete. Jay then began to shout at Anna, asking what she was doing looking through his tablet, to which she replied, "I'm not." "Why? Should I?" Anna told Jay that she didn't understand why he was acting the way he was, and he needed to do his schoolwork. She mentioned that his uncle would not be happy if he knew he was acting this way, and that he was using the living room TV without asking anyone. Jay snatched his tablet from Anna's hands. He got into her face and told her, "Tell him whatever you want. He's gonna believe me anyway." Then he stormed down the hallway, shoulder-checking Fern as he walked by. He went into his bedroom and slammed the door. A few hours later, David arrived home from work. Anna had texted him that Jay had thrown another fit, but she told him she would wait for him to get home to fill him in on the details. David got out of the car and noticed that the security screen door was once again ajar. He shook his head and went inside. As he walked in, the house felt empty. He knew that Tina would not be home because it was the day that her father picked her up after school. It felt odd not having Fred rush to greet him, but Checkers was laying in his usual spot on the couch. David reached down and gave Checkers a little hello head scratch, and then walked into the kitchen. He set his backpack down on the countertop and headed down the hallway. All the bedroom doors were closed, as this had become a norm in the house, and David still could not get used to. He approached his bedroom door, gave it a light knock, and then opened it and entered. Anna was sitting in the chair using her laptop. She had a glass of wine on the end table next to her. David closed the door behind him. He greeted her and kissed her and asked her how Fred was doing. Anna told him that she had just spoken with the vet's office and Fred was doing a lot better. They told her that he was eating and drinking again and that the trembling had calmed. They said that he still had not had any more seizures, and as long as he went potty normal, he'd be able to go home the next morning. David was relieved at the good news and asked what had happened with Jay's recent fit. Anna filled him in on what had happened with Jay when she returned home from the vet. David became furious. He couldn't believe that Jay would have the audacity to do those things. When Anna finished telling him everything, he burst out of the bedroom and went across the hall to Jay's room, entering without knocking. Jay was sitting on his bed using his tablet and jumped and shouted at David's unannounced entrance. David yelled at Jay to shut his mouth and demanded that he tell him what had happened when Anna got home from the vet. Jay told his uncle that Anna had yelled at him for using the TV and had rudely turned it off while he was playing a game online with his friend. David glared angrily at Jay. David then asked Jay if he had asked permission to use the living room TV while his aunt was at the vet. Jay did not answer. David then asked if his schoolwork was finished for the day. Jay said that it was. David then asked Jay to clarify that he had done his schoolwork after the incident with the TV because he knew that it was not completed before. Jay insisted that he had already done his schoolwork while Anna was at the vet. David told him that Anna pulled up his school syllabus and showed him that his work was not complete, and Jay claimed that she looked at it wrong, saying she looked at the wrong date. David was beginning to see red. David gave Jay one more chance to own up to what had really happened. Jay held his ground, stating that he had already explained it. David then informed him that he was once again grounded for a week. He was not to use electronics of any kind, with the exception of his schoolwork. Jay shouted about how it wasn't fair, that he hadn't done anything wrong, but David reminded him of a list of the things that Anna had told him. He told Jay that he hadn't asked permission to use the living room TV. He had been obnoxiously loud and rude to Fern while Anna was gone. He'd lied about the completion of his schoolwork. Jay exclaimed that none of it was true. David was fuming at this point and asked Jay if he was calling his aunt a liar. Jay sat silent for a moment, and then he replied, "Yeah, I am." David rushed at Jay and grabbed the collar of his t-shirt. He yanked Jay up to his feet with a force that Jay was not expecting. Jay's shirt ripped in the process, and he yelled at his uncle for ripping it. David let go of Jay and pushed him back down onto the bed, pointed his index finger directly in Jay's face, and told him never to insult his aunt again if he knew it was good for him. Jay was bawling openly and incoherently, shouted at David, asking if he was really going to believe his wife over his nephew. He yelled at David, "I'm your own flesh and blood." David stood menacingly over his nephew. He was now in a full-on rage. He took a few steps back and paced back and forth for a moment. Then he told Jay, "And that woman vowed to stand by me till death do us part. She became more my blood than you will ever be, boy." Jay screamed in rage and jumped to his feet, rushing at his uncle. Jay swung wildly and David sidestepped and dodged his attempt. He quickly caught Jay and had an arm lock and positioned his own leg behind his nephew. With one fluid moment, Jay had judo tossed Jay over his hip, and Jay now laid face down on the floor. David put his knee on Jay's back and grabbed the back of his hair, pulling back on his head. Jay cried out as Fern and Anna entered the room, shocked at what they were witnessing. David leaned down, still pulling on Jay's hair, and asked his nephew if he really wanted to continue this. Jay mumbled a low, "No," through his sobs, and David released him. He stood up and looked over at Anna and Fern, whose eyes were wide with disbelief. Then he looked back down at Jay and told him that he was now grounded indefinitely. If he wanted to end it, he would need to get a job. Then David left Jay's bedroom, walking past Fern and Anna in the process. He walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and retrieved a beer. He opened it and took a large gulp. Then he walked over to the sink and opened the cabinet above it. From the cabinet, he pulled out a shot glass and a bottle of whiskey. Anna called out his name and he turned to find her standing at the end of the hallway, where it met the kitchen. He looked at her, and then down at the shot glass and bottle, and then back at her. He pointed at the shot glass and asked her, "You want one?" Anna just looked at him for a moment and then replied, "Yes, please." A little time passed and Jay managed to get himself off his grounding restrictions by actually getting a part-time job at a fast food restaurant. Because of the liberal nature of his school schedule, he was able to work a variety of both daytime and evening hours. David said that he would allow it as long as it did not interfere with his schoolwork and as long as he was not scheduled to work too late in the evening. The city had a curfew for children under the age of 18, and David was not willing to test the level to which the local police were enforcing that curfew. Jay complained that it was too difficult to ride a skateboard, so David went out and purchased a used bicycle for Jay to get to and from work and school. Between school and work, Jay was not home very often anymore. When he was home, the family had become withdrawn. Fern and Tina would remain in their rooms, and even Anna would lock herself in their bedroom when David was at work rather than cross paths with Jay. The few run-ins that the family did have with Jay were always tumultuous. He never interacted kindly, always arguing or throwing accusations around and starting problems within the household. David and Anna were no longer drinking beer or wine. They had graduated to nothing but hard liquor, and they made it a daily habit. Tina was spending more time at her father's than she was at the Sanchez home. Jay's behaviors had driven wedges between each of the family members, and everyone was on constant guard, waiting to defend against whatever Jay would do or start next. Jay acted oblivious to the family's hardships, and when he was around, he currently acted gleefully and content. One day, David was at work and Jay was at school in person. Anna went out to the laundry room to wash a load of towels, but when she walked in, there was a basket of Jay's dirty clothes sitting on top of the washer. Anna moved the basket to open the washer to find out why. Fern had left a load of their clothes in the washer. Anna sighed, as she always had to finish chores the kids had started. She placed Fern's clothes in the dryer, which was empty, thankfully, and began to put Jay's into the washer. Despite the current nature of the household, Anna still tried to keep things together by doing things like chores the way she always had. She was not prepared, however, for what she found sticking out of the back pocket of one of Jay's pairs of joggers. As she loaded the solid black joggers, she noticed a flash of silver and was confused to find the wrapper from a milk chocolate candy bar. The only candy bars that Jay ever ate were those nasty cookies and cream ones that he would get from the convenience store. Her thoughts immediately went to Fred. Fred had recovered from the chocolate incident, but the family never found out where Fred had gotten the chocolate that had made him ill. Anna didn't want to admit it, but she knew that she may have finally found the answer to that question. Was it really possible that Jay had given chocolate to Fred? Anna couldn't fight the instincts that she had inherited from her father. She began to feel suspicious about some other events and decided to investigate. Anna went back inside the house and knocked on Fern's door. Fern shouted for her to come in, and Anna opened the door to find Fern sitting at their desk doing their schoolwork. Anna asked Fern if they could take a break for a minute, and Fern said, "Oh, of course." Anna asked Fern if they had ridden their longboard since they went to the emergency room. Fern had developed a problem with migraines since that incident and had recently begun taking medication for them. They told Anna that because of the headaches, they had not even touched their longboard since Tina leaned it against the wall of the bedroom that day they fell. Anna looked over at the board, leaning in the corner where Fern had pointed, and asked if she could inspect it. Fern nodded their head yes. Anna picked up the longboard and began looking it over. At first, she couldn't see anything wrong with it, and she turned it the other way and noticed that one of the trucks seemed to be a little loose. She grabbed the truck and attempted to wiggle it, and sure enough, Anna was admittedly no expert at skateboards, but something felt wrong. She asked Fern if the truck was supposed to be the way it was and handed the longboard to them. Fern looked it over and felt what Anna was talking about. A perplexed look came over Fern's face as they told Anna that no, it was not supposed to be that way. They also had no idea why it was. Fern admitted that they didn't always perform regular maintenance on their longboard, that there was no reason the truck should be that loose. Fern said there was definitely the reason they had lost control and fell that day, and apologized for not checking their equipment. Anna reassured Fern that it was not their fault and they didn't need to apologize. Then the wheels in her head started turning and she began to listen to her inherited instincts. Anna decided to look through Jay's room while he was still out. She left Fern's room and went to Jay's. Anna slowly opened the door to Jay's room. She wasn't sure why, but she felt uneasy going in there this time. As she opened the door, the stench of teenage boy hit her, and she had to cover her face with her hand for a moment to adjust to it. She began to scan the room, and Fred entered and stood next to her and began to whimper. Before all of his sister's kids moved in, David and Anna had used Jay's room as a craft room. They both worked on different types of art, and David toyed with writing music. These were things neither one of them had done since the kids moved in. There was still a tall bookshelf in the room where David displayed his movie collectibles. When they converted the room for Jay, they didn't really have another place for the shelf, so Jay said that he didn't mind if it stayed. Anna began to look over the shelf and saw 2 piggy banks that David had on it. She knew that David only put pennies in one of them and only quarters in the other. She picked up the one with the pennies. It was heavy, so she put it back down. She picked up the other one. Not only was it light, it was completely empty. She shook it, but there was nothing inside. Anna knew that David had been putting quarters in that bank for several years, and it should be heavy like the other one. She placed the piggy bank back where it was and continued to scan the room. Anna knelt down to look at the things that Jay had on the little end table next to his bed. They mostly had empty fountain drink cups and chip bags on it, but Anna noticed something on the floor behind the table, between the wall and the carpet. She reached behind the table and retrieved the object, which turned out to be a broken colored pencil. At first, this didn't seem unusual since Anna had several colored pencils in this room at one time, but then Anna took a closer look at the broken tip. The sharpened end was missing the lead of the pencil and it was broken off, but there was a buildup of material on that end. Anna looked at it closer and realized it was human skin. It looked like the pencil had been used to scrape someone. Jay's tablet had been lying on his bed this whole time, and while Anna was inspecting the colored pencil, the screen of the tablet lit up. She noticed it out of the corner of her eye and looked at the tablet to see that Jay had a new message on the social media. She got up from the floor and sat on the bed. She picked up the tablet and saw that the message was from a contact that she hadn't noticed while previously snooping through Jay's contact. Anna forgot for a moment that she was holding Jay's tablet, not hers, and opened the message to read it. It was from a young man giving Jay instructions to meet him after school to pick something up. Anna had no idea who the young man was, but was uncomfortable with the cryptic nature of the message. She closed the message and set the tablet back down on the bed. Anna looked around the room a little more, but nothing else seemed odd or even relevant. She had just decided to call it when she heard Jay's voice behind her call out her name. She jumped, startled, and turned around to see Jay standing in the doorway. She asked him why he was home. Jay replied that he had finished his classwork and the school let him leave early. Then he asked what she was doing in his room. Anna thought quickly and told him that she had just found his laundry basket in the laundry room and decided before she put it in the washer and started it that she'd make sure he didn't have anything else that needed to be in the wash with it. Jay stared at her, confused, and Anna knew why. She never collected laundry from Jay's room before, and that had to seem odd to him. Jay scanned the room, seemingly to check for things out of place. Anna realized that she still had the colored pencil in her hand and tried to conceal it. Jay looked back at her after a tense moment and told her that he just needed to change into his work clothes, and then she could add what he had worn to school to his load of laundry. Anna told him that she would wait to start the load until he had put what he was wearing into the laundry room. Then she told him that she'd leave his room so he could change. As she attempted to walk out, he blocked the doorway for a moment. She looked at him and aggressively said, "Excuse me." Jay reluctantly moved aside, and Anna walked out of the room and toward the kitchen. She heard Jay close his bedroom door behind her. She went to the kitchen and placed the colored pencil into a plastic sandwich bag. A little later, that day, David returned home from work. Anna was in the kitchen waiting for him when he arrived. When he walked in, she was taking a shot of rum. He asked her if everything was all right, although he knew better because of the day drinking he'd just witnessed. He braced himself emotionally for what Anna had to say. Anna told him that Jay had gone to work and said he was off work at 9 p.m. Then she told him about the candy bar wrapper and that she suspected Jay had given chocolate to Fred. She told him that she asked Fern about their longboard and that they discovered the truck on it had been loosened. David was having a hard time processing all this. Anna then told him that she decided to do some looking around in Jay's room and about how she had found David's empty piggy bank. David declared that that must be where Jay was coming up with the money out of nowhere. Then Anna told David about finding the broken colored pencil. She told him that she had found pieces of skin on the broken end. David wasn't sure how to fit that into everything, and Anna said that she wasn't quite sure either yet, but she told him that she suspected Jay may be responsible for a lot of the unusual events that had been occurring since he'd been in the household. Anna opened one of the kitchen drawers and retrieved 2 plastic sandwich bags. One of them contained the candy wrapper, the other the pencil. David couldn't help but chuckle at the way Anna had presented the items to him. He made a joke about her definitely being her father's daughter, and she jokingly told him to shut up as she was trying to be serious. David apologized and said that everything did seem suspicious, but that it could still be coincidental. Anna told him there were other incidents that they knew were his doing, such as the fights with the others over the TV, the incident with Puck, and the bird. Then she reminded him that there were still some things that couldn't be explained. Tina was never careless in the kitchen, yet the noodle bowl spilled over and burned her. Also, the physical assault that he had endured getting back the stolen skateboard that Jay hadn't ridden since that day. David asked Anna if she thought it was really possible that Jay was behind all of this, all their recent misfortunes. He told her that she had to admit it all sounded a little paranoid. Anna did admit that it sounded crazy even to her, but she could not ignore her gut instinct. Then she told David about how she had seen the suspicious message on Jay's tablet right before he walked in on her. David asked what the message had said, and she told him. He agreed to the suspicious nature of the message itself and asked her who it was from. She told him that it was an unknown contact on a separate social media account that she didn't know he had. Anna picked up her tablet, which had been lying on the countertop, and pulled up one of Jay's social media accounts. He had signed up for an additional account through his first one, so it was easy for Anna just to switch to the unknown account and bring up the message. David showed it to Anna, and he read it. Then he clicked on the profile pic of the person who had sent it. His eyes grew wide with surprise when the picture enlarged, and he could see who the account belonged to. Anna asked him what was wrong, and David turned to the tablet so she could see it. He told her that the young man in the profile picture was the one who Jay had accused of stealing his skateboard. He was one of the 3 young men that David had beat down when they jumped him. Everything was beginning to make sense, and Anna told David there was one more thing that she had recently discovered. She opened another of the kitchen drawers. This one was designated as the medicine drawer. It was a drawer that wasn't ventured into much by most of the family, but Jay's daily behavioral meds were kept in there. Anna began pulling bottle after bottle of Jay's prescriptions out and setting them on the countertop. The bottles appeared to be untouched. Jay was evidently not taking his medication, and they were accumulating in the drawer. David became angry with himself for not ever thinking to check to make sure Jay was taking his medication. Anna then opened the conferencing application that Jay had on his tablet and showed the call record to David. Jay wasn't taking his medications, but he was still speaking with his therapist on a regular basis. Everything seemed a little too methodical for Jay's apparent intelligence and maturity level to David, but he was beginning to think that Anna was right and that Jay was responsible for all the unusual occurrences. David recalled the different incidents surrounding Tina, how she said Jay had threatened the boy she liked. He thought about when Tina had burned herself the day Fern had fallen off their skateboard. He asked Anna if she thought Jay was responsible for Tina burning herself. Anna reluctantly told him that she did. Then David had another thought. He told Anna that it seemed like Jay had set all of them up for harm in some way, all of them but her. Anna reopened the drawer that she had retrieved the 2 plastic sandwich bags from and took out 2 of her asthma inhalers and set them on the countertop. David looked at her confused, and then she picked one up and squeezed it. Nothing came out. She showed David the counter that kept track of how many puffs were left in the inhaler. It read 0. She told David that the other one was also empty. Then she told him that the only working one she had left was the one that she kept in her purse. These 2 were the ones that she kept in the kitchen and their bedroom. This made David furious. If Jay really had done all of this, Anna was the one who he had planned the worst for. David and Anna knew that too much of this information fit together for things to be coincidental. David also knew that he had to tell Anna that he had spoken with his cousin JD again. Anna prepared herself as David began reading the conversation that he had with JD while on his lunch break that day. David had told JD that they had had some incidents involving their pets and that he needed JD to be honest and tell him what exactly Jay had done to his dog. JD had texted back, and he didn't like to rehash the exact events of what he had witnessed because he was still in therapy for it. But he did disclose to David that afterwards, his dog had become withdrawn, skittish, and even borderline violent. He said that they had taken the dog to the vet, and during the visit, it bit the doctor. Following testing for rabies and other such diseases, which all came back negative, the dog still had to be euthanized, according to county law. All the information that had been compiled that day and earlier seemed to point to Jay having some sociopathic, almost psychopathic tendencies, and it appeared that he had indeed been the root of all the recent family turmoil. As fate would have it, David's phone began to ring from a call while he was reading the last of the text from JD to Anna. The call was from Jay's place of employment. David answered the phone with a confused tone and was greeted by the voice of Jay's manager. He asked David if Jay was all right because he had not shown up for work for his shift or called to say that he wouldn't be there. David asked the manager to clarify that Jay was in fact not at work, and the manager said that was correct. David told Jay's manager that he had left for work quite some time earlier, before he had gotten home from work himself. Jay's manager apologized for not knowing what to say, but once again confirmed that Jay was not at work and told David that he hoped everything was okay. David thanked Jay's manager for contacting him and told him that he needed to look into why Jay was not there. The manager thanked David in return and ended the call. David and Anna looked at each other confused, as had become the norm with matters concerning Jay. David recalled that Anna said Jay had gotten home from school earlier, so he decided to call Jay's school to verify that he had been there and it was in fact an early dismissal day. David called the school, but the call was redirected to the front office voicemail. David left a message for the staff asking them to return his call as soon as possible. He stated in his message that Jay had not shown up for work and wondered if he had perhaps returned to the school. After calling the school, David and Anna knocked on Fern's door to tell them what was going on. They told Fern that they were going to drive around looking for Jay and instructed them to stay vigilant and contact them should he return home before them. Fern seemed a little frightened, but agreed and encouraged them to hurry back. David and Anna then got into their car and left the house. They drove around to the only few places they thought Jay could have gone. They checked the convenience store. He was not there, and the clerks, who were familiar with him, said that they had not seen him that day. They drove along the route he would take to school, but did not see him. When they got to his school, the doors were locked and no one seemed to be there. It was after hours, so the last afternoon class had concluded about an hour before, but they thought it was unusual that the entire staff had already gone home for the day. They drove the route he would take from school to work and still did not see him. When they got to his place of employment, they went inside and spoke to his manager in person. He told them that Jay still had not shown up for work or called. Finally, they drove the route that Jay would take home from work, but still no sign of him. They got back home and Fern told them that he had not returned there either. Without hearing back from the school, David and Anna agreed that there was only one thing left they could do. David picked up his phone and called the police. When the operator answered, he told her that he needed to report his teenage nephew missing. A few hours passed and David and Anna could only wait. The police told David after taking his report that an officer would be dispatched to take additional information from them, but they hadn't seen one yet. Despite the conclusions they had come to that day and everything that Jay had apparently done, he was still their nephew, and they were beginning to worry. Suddenly the doorbell rang and David looked out the window to see a police cruiser parked out front. He answered the door and two uniformed officers asked him to step outside and confirm his identity. He did as he was instructed and then asked the officers how he could help them. The officers asked him to confirm that he had called and reported his nephew missing, and he concurred. Then the officers shocked David by saying that Jay had been located at his school and had officers there with him currently. Anna appeared in the doorway and one of the officers greeted her. The officer asked David if this was his wife, Anna, and he told her that it was. David then asked why there were officers at the school with Jay. David was originally thinking that this had something to do with the cryptic message Jay had gotten from the skateboard stealer. He was not prepared for what the officers told him next. The officers went on to explain that Jay had gone to his school and requested sanctuary, stating that he feared for his safety and that he was being abused and neglected at home. David turned back and looked at Anna, and then turned back to the officers. The only thing he could think to say was, "Excuse me?" The officers further explained that Jay would be kept in their custody pending investigation of the claims, and that a caseworker from the Department of Child Safety would be there in a little while to give them some more information and to pick up Jay's medications. David and Anna were completely dumbfounded by this information. David wasn't sure, so he asked the officers if they were placing him under arrest. The officers chuckled to break the tensity of the situation and assured David that he was not being arrested. They said that they were only there to inform him that Jay had been located and that there would be additional steps taken. David then told the officers that Jay already had a caseworker, but the officers told him that given the time of day, it would most likely be an on-call intake caseworker that would be there at this time, and that Jay's actual caseworker would most likely follow up with them at a later time. The officers then thanked David and Anna for their time and told them they should be expecting the caseworker soon and hoped they would not get there too late into the evening. Then they said goodbye to David and Anna and left. Not long later, David received a call from a strange number. When he answered it, it was the intake caseworker from the Department of Child Safety. She was calling to confirm the Sanchez's address, and when David told her that she had it correct, she informed him that she was already en route and would be there in a few minutes. When she arrived, David and Anna invited her in, but she declined and just asked for Jay's medication. While Anna retrieved all the medicine bottles, the caseworker began explaining to David that Jay had accused him, Anna, and Leah of physical and emotional abuse, and that Suzanne would be stopping by the next day to discuss what would happen next. Anna returned from the kitchen with all of Jay's medicine bottles in the locked bag that the group home had originally brought them in. The caseworker commented on how full the bag was, and David told her that they had recently discovered that Jay may not have been taking them. The caseworker then commented that was odd because Jay seemed very concerned about getting his medicines once she had spoken to him. As they talked, David's phone began to ring with another call. This time, it was Suzanne. David told the intake caseworker that Jay's full-time caseworker was calling, and she said good because she was probably wanting to schedule tomorrow's meeting with them. She told him she would leave them to take the call and apologize for being so late as she left. David answered the call and Suzanne greeted him, sounding weary. She asked how his evening was going, and he made a sarcastic remark that she needed to tell him. She apologized for everything that was happening and explained that she had just finished talking with the police at Jay's school and Jay himself about the latest accusation. She told David that she and another caseworker needed to come over and discuss some things with him and Anna. David told Suzanne that he was not scheduled to work the next day and that they could come by at any time. Suzanne and David set up a time, and Suzanne thanked him and ended the call. David and Anna went to the kitchen. David set his phone down on the countertop and asked Anna to pour him another shot of vodka. The next morning, the doorbell rang around the time that David and Suzanne had set up. David did his best to calm down Fred and back him up so that he could answer the door and invite Suzanne in. When he opened the door, Suzanne stood there with another caseworker, as she had said. Once inside and sitting at the dining room table, Suzanne took out her laptop and set it up. While she did so, the other caseworker began explaining the accusations more in depth to David and Anna. She asked where Leah was, and when David and Anna told her that Leah had moved out several months before, she seemed confused. The caseworker went on to explain that Jay had told them that he was constantly punished for no reason, and that he was often ridiculed and belittled by the family, and that it made him depressed. He also claimed that both Leah and David had physically assaulted him on different occasions, and he had offered them proof. Now it was David and Anna's turn to look confused. David asked what proof he had given. Suzanne chimed in and told them that there were a few pictures that Jay had given the day before, ones that had claimed to collect over time. She turned her laptop so they could all see and began to swipe through the pictures. The first one showed the inside of Jay's arm. There were 3 long scratches along his arm that were lightly bleeding in the picture, and Jay had claimed that Leah had done it to him in an argument. Anna remembered the colored pencil and sprung to her feet and rushed to the kitchen drawer. She startled the 2 caseworkers a little, and they jumped in their seats when she got up. She quickly returned with the plastic sandwich bag that contained the pencil. She set it on the table between the 2 caseworkers and told them that how she'd found it in Jay's bedroom. She pointed out the dried skin on the broken point and exclaimed that she'd remembered him accusing Leah of scratching him and her adamantly denying it. She declared that he must have done it himself with the pencil. The 2 caseworkers were a little shocked at this accusation, but couldn't deny the possibility. Suzanne swiped through the next few pictures. They showed bruises on Jay's elbow and wrist. David recognized these and told the caseworker about the time Jay had gotten physical with him over the basketball. He had admitted to subduing Jay, but swore that he never intended to hurt him. He explained that Jay had endured the bruises during their scuffle. Suzanne said there was one more thing she needed to ask them about as she reached into her attaché and retrieved a t-shirt. She said that Jay had told them the t-shirt had been torn by David during another incident. David admitted that there had been another physical incident other than the one that he had just mentioned, but he swore that he had no intentions of hurting Jay, and that the shirt had been torn by accident. The other caseworker then added that Jay had claimed neglect in addition to abuse. He had told them that he often got in trouble for getting into the refrigerator and that he was afraid to take food from the pantry. David told them that since getting the fast food job, it was all Jay had eaten, and if he was afraid to go into the pantry, it was because he had indeed gotten into trouble for eating too frequently a few times. But he tried to assure the caseworker that Jay would never be denied food if he were truly hungry. The caseworker then asked David and Anna if they had witnessed any unusual behaviors in Jay. She said that it did appear that he had stopped taking his medications, and they were concerned that it had affected his behavior. David and Anna looked at each other, and David said to her, "Let's tell them everything." David and Anna told the two caseworkers about every incident that had occurred since Jay had been in the house. They told them about all the times Jay had been yelled at for standing in doorways like a creep. The two caseworkers looked at each other as if they had experienced it for themselves. They told them about the misogynistic tendencies. The two caseworkers, both female, again looked at each other. They told them about how Leah had moved out rather than live with him. They told them about Jay threatening the boy Tina had liked. They told him about the incidents with Puck, Fred, and about how David had been jumped by 3 young men over the supposedly stolen skateboard. Lastly, they told him about all the evidence they had found the day before. David asked if they had known about the previous incidents with JD's dog and the school district that expelled Jay. He asked if they did know why they didn't tell them. Suzanne appeared as though she were embarrassed by the whole situation. The other caseworker was more empathetic toward David and Anna. She told them that after speaking with Jay, they had an idea that these claims were most likely false. She said that for now, Jay had been placed into another group home and that he would undergo a new psychiatric evaluation with his therapist. She asked David and Anna if after the evaluation and the investigation concluded, would they allow Jay back into the house. David and Anna looked at each other and didn't need to say anything. David could tell by the look in Anna's face how she felt. He looked at Suzanne, who appeared hopeful. Then he looked at the other caseworker, who appeared indifferent and just needed an answer. He told her that because of all the things that Jay had done since being in the household and these new absurd accusations, that he and Anna did not feel it was best if Jay came back to live with them. He looked back at Suzanne and told her that when they performed the psychiatric evaluation, they should keep things like antisocial personality disorder in mind when testing. The two caseworkers looked at each other confused. David told them that when he graduated from high school, he had attended college at a major university and studied psychology. He went on to say that he didn't finish because he realized that he had only done it to appease his parents. He said he remembered enough of what he had learned to be able to identify certain things. Then he cursed himself for ignoring them in Jay because of his loyalty to his dead sister. Suzanne apologized for things not working out, and David looked at her menacingly. She had no idea that he and Anna knew who her husband was and about the strange coincidences surrounding Jay's case. The other caseworker thanked David and Anna for their time as Suzanne packed up her laptop. All four stood up from the dining room table, and David and Anna walked to the two caseworkers to the door. Much time passed, and the Sanchez family began to get back to somewhat normal lifestyle. It wasn't easy, as some damage had been done to everyone emotionally. Leah had moved out of state with a boyfriend without telling them. Tina had only recently gotten back to her regular custody schedule after electing to stay at her father's a majority of the time, due to Jay. Fern had been through a few different prescriptions, but had not gained control of the migraines that began after the longboard incident. As a secondary result, they still had not ridden it again. David and Anna were in counseling and were now recovering alcoholics. They had both just received their very first chip from Alcoholics Anonymous. Puck and Fred had both become quite skittish. It took some time for Puck to become the loving cat he was now. Fred seemed like he's developed paranoia and now barked at every shadow and reflection that came through the front window. Checkers seemed unaffected. Only one. Lucky cat. The entire time, David had not stopped thinking about one thing. Jay's 18th birthday was approaching. He wondered what would happen. With nowhere to go, Jay would most likely be placed into state-funded housing and a job program. There, he would be taught how to function as an independent adult. David wondered, what if the state just wipes their hands clean of Jay and releases him to the general populace? David had attempted to keep track of Jay's whereabouts using mistakes made by the Department of Child Safety since he'd been gone. David still received text messages from the pharmacies that were filling his prescriptions and emails from the school where he had attended, and also still had access to some of Jay's social media sites as well. They were at least able to keep track of what city he was in, and as his 18th birthday approached, he was halfway across the state. Knowing that brought comfort to Anna and the kids, but David knew otherwise. David recognized that as far as personalities go, Jay was very much like his mother and even more like his grandfather, David's stepfather. David knew that vindictive nature that came along with that personality, as well as the overwhelming sense of entitlement and selfishness that was exhibited by that side of the family. He knew that Jay was petty, and because he had plotted to bring harm to each of them while he was living with them, he would plot revenge. After Jay moved out, David decided to take his neighbor Mac's advice, and he had installed security cameras outside the house. He didn't bother with a doorbell camera, though he set up a perimeter of motion detectors and hidden cameras around the Sanchez house. In addition, David had resumed his mixed martial arts training that he had stopped doing years before, and was passing his knowledge on to the family. To top things off, the family had also adopted another dog, a pit bull boxer mix named Aries. David had also purchased a variety of personal defense items for his family members. Each of them now owned pocket knives, disguised knuckles, pepper sprays, and stun guns. They all each owned their own telescoping batons, like the trusty one David had kept under the driver's seat of his car all along. Some friends, co-workers, and peers of the family felt the Sanchez's were taking things too far, as they had gone into full survivalist mode. Some even called them paranoid, but just when the family was beginning to research firearms, David's preparations would be put to use. Jay's 18th birthday came and went on the calendar, and a few days passed after that. Most of the family paid no attention to it, but David stayed vigilant. One night, the family slept. David woke to the sound of Fred and Aries running through the doggy door to bark at something. As he opened his eyes, the motion sensors in the back triggered the floodlights that illuminated the entire backyard. David looked through the blinds, but he couldn't see anything. He got out of bed and was putting his slippers on when Anna sat up and asked him what it was. David picked up his phone and opened his security surveillance app to check the camera. He scrolled through the backyard cameras, but only saw the dogs at the side of the fence, still barking. He checked the front yard and just caught a glimpse of someone in a hooded sweatshirt ducking into a corner of the porch as the motion sensor turned the front lights on. David told Anna that there was an intruder on the front porch, and he picked up a baseball bat and headed down the hallway. He shouted at her to keep the kids inside and called the police. David peeked through the curtain on the front door. The entire front yard was lit up, so he knew the only place the intruder could be if they were still out there was the blind spot he'd watched them duck into on camera just a few moments before. David grinned and opened the front door. As soon as he did, the intruder jumped into view of the doorway. It was Jay. In his hand, he held a 9mm handgun. In a very cocky tone, he said, "Hi, Theo." He raised the gun to aim at David. As he did, David noticed that the family still hadn't learned to do the first thing he started reminding everyone to do after Jay had left. Despite all the security details that David had installed, no one ever remembered to close and lock the security screen door correctly, and it was ajar, as usual. In an instant, Jay sloppily aimed the gun at David with only one hand like he'd seen in movies and pulled the trigger. But in that same instant, David kicked the security screen door with all his might. The door flung open and struck Jay, easily knocking the weapon from his arrogant grip and striking him in the face, sending him stumbling backward. David dropped the bat and rushed out the door, attempting to grab his nephew, but he quickly discovered the reason he had let go of the bat was he could not lift his right arm. He felt a stinging, burning sensation and realized that the bullet had grazed his shoulder and caused quite a bit of tissue damage. Jay held his face in his hands because the screen door caused a good deal of damage to him as well. His nose was broken and his eyes filled with tears, blinding him. As he attempted to clear his vision, David rushed at him and all Jay saw was a blur as his uncle speared him, knocking him over the little retaining wall that surrounded the front porch. The force of the tackle actually knocked a few of the bricks loose. The back of Jay's head hit the ground hard, and he swung wildly, landing a lucky strike on his uncle's wounded shoulder. David screamed in pain, and the distraction gave Jay enough time to squirm out from under him, kicked David in the side of the face. David fell over on his side, and Jay struggled to his feet. He stood and looked around for a moment, searching for the gun. He saw it on the ground next to the house and tried to run for it, but David caught him around the legs and brought him to the ground again. The two struggled for position on the ground, something David would have won easily if not for the wound on his shoulder. Unable to use his arm, however, gave Jay an almost even playing field, and he fought his uncle ferociously. Jay bit David and clawed at his eyes with his fingers, and David tried desperately to tie his nephew up and pin him to the ground. Jay reached up and dug his thumb into the wound on David's shoulder, and David again screamed in agony. David continued to fight for position, but his nephew was on the verge of overpowering him. Then David heard Fern call his name and looked up to see them toss something toward him. As he reached up to catch it, his wounded arm left him open and Jay caught him with a throat punch. David again fell over on his side and rolled onto his back. As he struggled to gasp for air, Jay climbed on top of him in a mount position and reached over and picked up one of the loose bricks from the retaining wall. Jay released a blood-curdling scream of rage as he raised the brick to smash it into his uncle's face. But his hesitation would cost him. David had caught the object that Fern had tossed him, and even though he still could not breathe from the throat punch, he had enough of his wits about him to use it. With a flick of his wrist, the baton telescoped open, and David swung with all the strength he could muster from his left arm. The baton struck Jay in the temple with a sickening thud that sounded like a hammer smashing a stone. Jay fell over onto his side and laid there, motionless. David laid on the ground next to his lifeless nephew for a few moments, still trying to catch his breath. He looked up to see Anna, Fern, and Tina kneeling over him. They were asking him if he was okay. Anna was holding her hands firmly over the wound on his shoulder. The neighbor, Mac, had showed up at some point and was talking to the police on Anna's phone. She had handed it to him to tend to David. Moments later, police and paramedics arrived on the scene. They rushed to tend to both David and Jay, though there was nothing they could do for Jay. Other officers approached Anna and the kids to check if they were all right, and Mac attempted to explain to others exactly what part he was playing by being there. After some time, the coroner's office arrived with 2 homicide detectives. As the coroner and his assistant prepared to tend to Jay's body, one of the police officers approached David and Anna and introduced the detectives as Detective Kim and Cook. Anna rolled her eyes, turned around, and said, "Hi, Dad." Everyone, including Detective Kim, looked at Detective Cook confused. He replied to her, "Hello, Annie. It's been a while." Jay's body was cremated and his ashes were mixed with his mother's. David said that he felt that all Jay ever wanted was to be with his mother. Now they were together on the shelf in the Sanchez house, waiting for David to decide what to do with them. At the advice of a friend, Anna had placed a ring of salt around the urn. David was charged with manslaughter in Jay's death, but the court considered it self-defense, and he was only sentenced to 8 months in prison with an additional 3 years of supervised probation and several hundred hours of community service to follow. The family sometimes struggled without David at home, but they had all learned well and got by. David had only been behind bars for a few days when someone approached him in the yard. He was sitting at a table reading The Art of War when he heard a gruff voice speak behind him. The inmate asked him if his name was David. David didn't want to start any trouble, so he just answered kindly that it was. The man told David that despite the circumstances of his crime being self-defense, he had still killed a kid, and that meant he would need someone to watch his back for the short time he was in. David turned and looked up at the man who was speaking to him and immediately recognized him. David asked the man, "Aren't you Juan Delgado?" The inmate confirmed that he was indeed. David asked why he should trust him, seeing as he had killed kids as well. Juan told him that was exactly why he should. He explained that the other inmates were all terrified of him because of the things that he had done. They viewed him as a monster. He told David that he had been once and that he had fixed himself. He said that some people had been very cruel and were not innocent. They had killed someone who had helped him fix himself, someone who he had loved very much. Juan told David that he was unable to protect his loved one, but David had, and he respected him for that. That was why he wanted to protect David, because David's loved ones were still out there, waiting for him to return and protect them. David thanked Juan, but told him that he knew nothing came for free. They were in prison after all, so he wanted to know what was in it for Juan. Juan replied, "I recently found out that I have a grandson. I can't be out there for him. I need someone to look after him for me. You know him. His name is Miguel." Juan turned to walk away. David stopped him and asked him what the name of the loved one the people he had killed had hurt was. Juan turned and looked at David with a tear in his eye and said, "Bella." Suzanne and her husband walked into the Greenhaven Country Club and went straight to Victor Wolf's office. She wasn't sure why her husband had brought her to this meeting that the president had called with him. The two entered the office and Mr. Wolf greeted them enthusiastically and asked them to sit. He offered them a drink and they declined, so he got right down to business. He told Suzanne that she was exactly the reason why he had called the meeting. She looked at him puzzled. He continued by saying that he had spent a long time attempting to locate someone who could fill the open apprentice position. He explained that he had tasked her with one thing, and that was to find someone who had burned all their bridges in life so they could be molded for the purpose of the country club and its associates. He further explained that it was bad enough that his nephew had located the young man for her before he was killed on his hunting expedition, especially considering what a failure his nephew had been. He asked Suzanne why she had failed in discovering that the boy, Jay, had additional family that might get in the way. Suzanne started to speak out, but Mr. Wolf stopped her and said that it was actually a rhetorical question because he didn't care why she had failed, just that she had. Then he explained that because Mr. Bjorn was still left without an apprentice, he had let him decide what to do with her. Suzanne looked at her husband and grabbed his arm, which he yanked from her grasp. She begged him to do something, but he ignored her and refused eye contact. Mr. Wolf motioned for someone to come in, and a man, dressed in all black, entered the room. Suzanne begged and pleaded with Mr. Wolf, but he too ignored her and turned his back to her. The man in black grabbed Suzanne by the shoulders while she sat in the chair and tossed her up onto his shoulder. She kicked and screamed, but could not break his grasp. She begged her husband for help, but he continued to ignore her. Mr. Wolf then told her that Mr. Bjorn had requested her presence during the Low Forest hunt, and since those that didn't have suits were not allowed to witness hunts, she knew what that meant. Suzanne screamed in terror and pleaded as the man in black carried her out of the room. Her screams continued to be heard for a short time as she was carried down the hallway. Victor Wolf served 2 glasses of scotch and set one in front of Suzanne's husband. He held the other up in a toasting motion and told Suzanne's husband, "Sorry about your wife." Then he sipped his scotch and walked over to the window to gaze out over the city. David was lying on his bunk in his cell, once again reading The Art of War. His cellmate was asleep on the bunk above him. One of the guards was making mail call rounds and was walking the corridor, distributing the letters appropriately. The guard stopped in front of David's cell and said, "Sanchez, mail call." David was shocked. Anna and the kids frequently visited him, so he didn't know who could possibly be sending him mail. He stood up and walked over to the cell door and took the letter from the guard to the slot. He sat back down on his bunk and took it out of the open envelope and unfolded it. The letter was from Leah, and it read, "Hello, Theo David. I can't stay in Illinois anymore. My boyfriend and I broke up, and his family kicked me out. I'm taking a bus back home as soon as I have enough money, and I called the IANA and asked if I could stay at your house until I get on my feet. I hope that's okay. I'm sorry you're in there for the things that Jay did, but at least the nightmare is over. I also wanted to tell you so you're not surprised when you get out. I'm pregnant."
It will take some time for the Sanchez's to live normal lives again. Damage done can be scarring and permanent. Even those you're supposed to trust the most can't always be trusted. Thank you for listening to Season 1. I look forward to bringing you more tales in the future. Until next time, I'm sorry if I scared you.